The day Kelly came back was the day everything in our marriage finally started to fall apart. I remember hearing her footsteps on the stairs, the clatter of her suitcase rolling behind her. For a moment, it felt like she was still the same woman who had been my partner for the past 12 years. My wife, the one I had once trusted completely. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew things were different now. It had been a quiet weekend for me. While Kelly was away on what she had called a hall pass, I spent my days working and my nights alone. I'd never been good at being alone, but it seemed easier this time. In some strange way, I had convinced myself that I was fine with her being gone. After all, she had insisted it would be just a weekend, just a brief escape. She'd begged me for permission, saying it was a chance for her to have some space, but I knew that wasn't the whole story. I was in the kitchen when she walked in, dragging her suitcase behind her. Kelly wore a fitted sweater in a deep red color, one she knew I loved on her. Her hair was a little mussed, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but she still managed to look stunning in her understated way. She always did, at least until the past few months. The light in her eyes had dimmed, and the warmth that had once existed between us was now replaced with a cold distance. "Hey," she said softly, almost nervously. There was a hesitation in her voice that made me want to turn around and face her, but I stayed where I was, running my hand over the smooth surface of the countertop. I didn't look up immediately. I knew what was coming, and I wasn't sure I could handle it yet. "You pack my stuff?" she asked, her voice cracking just a little as she glanced at the small stack of bags I had placed by the door. I sighed. "Yeah, I packed your things," I replied, my words coming out flat, devoid of emotion. I kept my back to her, not willing to let her see just how angry I was. She didn't move, and for a moment there was silence in the room, the kind that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. I could feel her eyes on me, but I still couldn't look at her. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. "Chris," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you doing this?" I finally turned to face her, and it hit me all at once. The weight of everything that had happened over the last few months. The late-night arguments, the distance growing between us, her constant insistence that things were fine even when I knew they weren't. I had told myself I could keep going, that I could push through it. But this was different. What she had done changed everything. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to keep my composure. "I'm doing this because I can't pretend anymore," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I can't just ignore what's happened. You made your choice, Kelly." Her face fell, and she stepped back as if I had slapped her. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. She looked like a different person, the woman I had once known, slipping away into someone I didn't recognize. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" she asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper now. "You're really going to go through with it?" "Of course I am," I replied, the anger I had been holding back starting to break through. "You slept with someone else, Kelly. You went out and did exactly what we both knew was wrong, and now you're acting like it didn't happen. You can't just sweep this under the rug." Her jaw clenched and she crossed her arms over her chest, her expression hardening. "You're overreacting," she said, but there was no conviction in her words. "It was just one weekend, Chris. It doesn't have to mean anything. It was just a mistake." I shook my head, feeling a rush of emotion flood my chest. "A mistake? Do you even hear yourself? This wasn't just some mistake, Kelly. This was a choice you made, and it's one you made behind my back. That's what hurts the most. The betrayal. You went and gave your body to someone else like it was nothing, and you want me to just forgive you like it didn't matter? My voice was rising now, my words coming faster, almost a stream of consciousness. I'm not that guy anymore. I'm not the guy who sits quietly and lets his wife walk all over him. You crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. She flinched, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her. But I wasn't done. You don't get to act like this is some kind of trivial thing. This is my life. This is my marriage you're talking about. And you treated it like it didn't matter. I could feel my pulse quicken, the blood rushing to my head as the reality of what had happened settled over me. You don't get to come back from this, Kelly. Not after everything. There was a long, charged silence between us, and I could see the struggle on her face. She wanted to fight. I could see it in her eyes, but she didn't know where to start. I had already shut her out. The damage had been done. After a long pause, she let out a small, shaky breath. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said quietly, almost apologetically. Her voice was so soft now, and I could hear the regret in it. I never wanted to hurt you, Chris. But you've been distant lately. We've been distant. I needed something. I clenched my jaw, trying to control the anger rising in me. You didn't need him, Kelly. You needed to talk to me. You needed to tell me how you were feeling instead of sneaking around behind my back. My words were cutting, each one feeling sharper than the last. This wasn't about needing something. This was about running away from us. I thought. Maybe if I had some space, things could be different, she said, her eyes now filled with a mix of guilt and confusion. I thought it would help, but I see now that it didn't. I was wrong. Yeah, you were, I said, my voice bitter, the finality of it echoing in the empty space between us. And now we're here. I turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore. I didn't want to see the tears in her eyes, the remorse that felt so fake to me now. The damage was already done. I had made up my mind. Do you want me to leave? She asked quietly, almost nervously. I felt the weight of her question settle over me like a heavy blanket. I wanted to scream, to lash out at her, to tell her how much pain I was in. But instead, I took a deep breath and looked back at her, my voice cold as I said, No, you can stay. Just move into the guest room. I'm staying in the master. Her face fell, and I could see the shock in her eyes. She probably expected me to beg her to stay, to act like everything was fine again. But I wasn't that person anymore. I couldn't be. She didn't say anything after that. She just turned and slowly walked up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I knew what was coming next. We both knew it. I stood in the kitchen for a while, the silence now louder than anything I had ever heard. I couldn't bring myself to move, to clean up the mess, or even start making dinner. I just stood there, processing everything, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Kelly had made her choice, and so had I. The life I had once known was slipping away, piece by piece, and I wasn't sure what was left for either of us. The trust that had been built over years of marriage had been shattered in a single weekend, and I didn't know if there was any way to repair it. As the hours passed, I knew one thing for sure. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. The following days felt like a slow, deliberate unraveling of something I had once believed was unbreakable. I had always considered Kelly and me to be inseparable. We had built our lives together, weathered countless storms, and celebrated even more victories. But now, all of that seemed like a distant memory, fading in the face of the reality that sat between us, cold and unyielding. The tension in the house was suffocating. Kelly stayed in the guest room as we had agreed, but the silence between us was deafening. The very air seemed thick with things left unsaid, with emotions we couldn't articulate. I could hear her moving around upstairs, the soft sound of her footsteps through the floorboards, but it only reminded me that we were both here in the same house, and yet we were miles apart. I tried to keep myself busy, to focus on work, to do anything that might take my mind off the mess that our marriage had become. But it was impossible. Every time I looked at the kitchen counter, I was reminded of the night she came back, of the words we'd exchanged, of the hurt that still hung in the air like a cloud. On the third morning after she returned, I found myself in the kitchen, staring absently out the window. The rain had started the night before, drumming softly against the roof, and the gray sky seemed to reflect the heaviness I felt inside. I didn't know what to do anymore. It wasn't just about the affair, though that was bad enough. It was the way she had handled it, the way she acted like it could just be forgotten, like she could come back and pretend everything was normal, as if we could just resume where we had left off before everything went wrong. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't just pretend. I turned my head as I heard the creak of the stairs, the soft shuffle of Kelly's steps as she descended. She entered the kitchen slowly, almost hesitantly, as though she wasn't sure how to approach me. I didn't look at her right away. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, trying to steady myself before I had to face her again. "Chris," she said softly, and the sound of my name on her lips hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't used my name like that in months, and it stung. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I wanted to talk, but in the silence that followed, I realized she wasn't going to go away. I took a deep breath and turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. She was standing near the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes looking anywhere but at me. Her long brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she was wearing one of my old t-shirts, faded and worn, just like everything between us. "About what?" I asked, my voice colder than I had intended. She flinched, but only for a moment. She took a step closer, her movements slow and careful as though she was afraid of breaking something. "I don't know," she said, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. "Maybe about what's happening to us, about where we go from here." The words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Where we go from here. It was a question I had been asking myself for days, ever since she returned. I didn't know if there was a here anymore, if there was a future for us. But hearing her say it out loud made it all feel too real. "You really think we can just fix this?" I asked, the bitterness creeping into my voice before I could stop it. "After everything? After what you did?" Kelly's face tightened, but she didn't back down. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she said, her voice catching slightly, "but I think we can at least try. I love you, Chris. I don't want to lose you." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know if I still loved her. The love I had for her felt distant, clouded by the betrayal, by the fact that she had made a choice that shook everything I had ever believed about us. She had hurt me, in a way that I didn't know how to come back from. "I don't know if I can just forget it, Kelly," I said, my voice quieter now. "I don't know if I can just go back to being the person I was before. You destroyed something inside me, and I don't know how to fix it." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she wiped them away quickly as though she was ashamed of them. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted to. But I was so lost, Chris." I felt like you were slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to fix it. I thought maybe if I did this, I'd feel something. But now I know I was wrong. I shook my head, unable to look at her. You thought cheating on me would make things better? You thought that would fix everything? She winced at my words, but there was no defensiveness in her eyes. She knew she had made a mistake. She knew there was no excuse for what she had done, and yet she was standing here, apologizing, pleading for forgiveness. I know it was stupid, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what else to say. I'm so sorry, Chris. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, but it didn't make the hurt go away. It didn't take away the betrayal I felt, the way my trust in her had been shattered beyond repair. Even now, in this moment where she was standing in front of me, apologizing, I didn't feel the same connection I used to. The intimacy that had once been so natural between us was gone, replaced by a wall I wasn't sure I could tear down. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally, the words coming out more harshly than I intended. I don't know if I even want to. You've changed everything, Kelly, and I don't know how to fix it. The tears that had been threatening to spill from her eyes finally broke free, and she wiped at her face in an attempt to regain control. I understand, she whispered. I really do. And if you don't want to be with me anymore, I'll leave. I won't make this harder for you. I just want you to know how sorry I am. The words stung, but in some strange way, they also gave me clarity. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. But I wasn't ready to end it. Not yet. The thought of losing her was just as painful as the thought of living with the weight of her betrayal. I didn't know what was the right thing to do. But I knew one thing. We couldn't keep going on like this. Something had to change. I'm not saying it's over, I said, after a long pause, my voice quiet but firm. But I need space, Kelly. I need time to think, to figure out what this is, what we are. I can't just rush into making a decision. Her eyes softened, and she nodded slowly, though I could see the tears still shining in them. I'll give you all the space you need, she said, her voice almost breaking again. I just want you to know that I'm here. I want to make it right. I didn't respond right away. What could I say? Could I ever make it right? Could she? Could we? I didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for us. But that was a long way off. For now, the only thing I could do was take things one step at a time. The following days were a blur of cold silence and forced routine. The house felt emptier, though Kelly was still there. It was like we were both going through the motions of daily life, but without any of the warmth or comfort that once defined our existence together. I couldn't look at her without feeling a mix of rage, hurt, and confusion. Every word she spoke seemed hollow, as though it had been drained of all meaning. I tried to keep busy with work, but even the distractions of the office couldn't keep my mind from drifting back to that weekend. To the images of her with him. Of the way she had looked when she came back, expecting things to just be as they were before. The audacity of it all still left me speechless. She thought I could just forgive her because she'd said sorry, as though that would somehow make everything better. But it didn't. It couldn't. I spent more time than I cared to admit thinking about what came next. Was I supposed to just pretend it never happened? Move on as if she hadn't betrayed me in the worst way possible? Or was I supposed to fight for her, for us, even though I wasn't sure who we were anymore? I'd asked for space, and Kelly gave it to me. It wasn't a relief. It just felt like we were drifting further apart, slowly, inevitably. Every time I walked through the house, the walls felt closer, like the space between us was shrinking, but not in a way that would bring us closer together. It was a separation, one I didn't know how to reverse. I could hear her up there, moving around in the guest room. Sometimes I'd hear her talking softly on the phone, but I couldn't bring myself to care enough to eavesdrop. Whatever she said to her friends or family wasn't something I wanted to hear right now. I knew she was getting support, and maybe that was fine, but I didn't have anyone. There were no conversations where I could vent or express the anger and hurt that had consumed me since finding out what she had done. I had a therapist, sure, but I hadn't been back to see her since before the weekend that ruined everything. Instead, I would come home from work, eat in silence, and retreat to the living room. The television became my refuge, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the thoughts that kept creeping into my mind. One night, after a particularly grueling day at the office, I came home to find the house unusually quiet. Kelly wasn't in the living room, where I expected her to be, but the lights were on upstairs, so I assumed she was in the guest room. I tried to shake off the bitter taste of the day as I made my way into the kitchen, hoping that a cup of coffee might settle me. It was as I stood there, leaning over the counter, when Kelly appeared at the doorway. She hesitated, just standing there for a moment before walking slowly into the kitchen. "Chris," she began, her voice soft, "can we talk? I've been thinking about everything, and I know I've messed up, but I need you to hear me out. Please." I turned around slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time in what felt like days. She looked different, worn down, pale, and tired. But there was something else, too, a desperation in her eyes that unsettled me. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to walk away and tell her I had nothing left to say. But instead, I nodded. "Okay, talk." She let out a long breath before speaking again, as if gathering the courage to say the words. "I don't know where to start, but I know I've hurt you more than anyone ever should. I know I've betrayed you, and I'll never be able to undo that. But I need you to know that I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could compartmentalize everything. But I was wrong. I see that now. I was so caught up in what I thought I wanted, in what I thought would make me feel better, that I never considered how it would hurt you." I didn't respond at first. The silence between us was thick, and my mind was racing with all the emotions I had been holding back. I wanted to tell her that it didn't matter, that nothing she said could fix what she had done. But instead, I found myself speaking words I didn't think I'd ever say. "Do you even know what you've done, Kelly?" I asked, my voice tight. "You've broken my trust in a way that I don't even know how to put back together. I don't even know if I want to. You didn't just cheat on me. You dismissed everything we had, everything we've built together. I didn't even matter enough to you to think about what it would do to me. You didn't think about me at all. You only thought about yourself." She winced, but didn't interrupt. "And now," I continued, "you want me to just, what? Pick up where we left off? Pretend like none of this happened? No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to think. I know I've screwed up, but I love you. And I'm not giving up on us, Chris. I'm asking you to let me show you that I can be the woman you thought I was, the woman you deserve." Her words were heartfelt, but they did nothing to ease the storm that raged inside me. The truth was, I didn't know if I could ever believe in her again. Even if she said all the right things, even if she apologized 100 times, it didn't change the fact that she had crossed a line I couldn't unsee. I wasn't sure how to move forward if I even wanted to. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her to get out of my life, but there was a small part of me, the part I didn't want to admit, that still wanted to fix things, that still cared, despite everything. I don't know if I can get past this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I want to forgive you. I understand, Kelly said, her voice soft, resigned. I know I've hurt you too much. I don't expect you to just forgive me overnight. But I need you to know that I am willing to do whatever it takes, whatever you need. I'll give you all the time you need, Chris, but please don't shut me out completely. Please, don't give up on us just yet. She was begging now, but it wasn't enough. I could see how badly she wanted things to go back to normal. How much she was still clinging to the idea that we could fix this. But I wasn't sure anymore. The cracks in our relationship had grown too wide, and I wasn't sure if we could repair it, or if I even wanted to try. I'm not giving up on you, Kelly, I said, finally looking at her. But I need to figure out what I want. And I need to figure out if I can ever trust you again. If we can ever be the same again. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I'll give you that time. I promise. But I'll be here when you're ready. With that, she turned and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my thoughts, unsure of what the next step was. Everything felt so broken, so far beyond repair. And I didn't know if it was worth trying to put it all back together. The days that followed were a constant tug of war between what I wanted to do and what I thought I should do. Kelly was patient for the most part, giving me the space I'd asked for. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk to her, but every time I did, it felt like I was reopening a wound that I wasn't ready to face yet. I'd think about the good times we had, the years we'd spent together, but then I'd remember her walking out of our marriage for one weekend, giving herself to someone else, someone who wasn't me, and I felt the weight of that betrayal in ways I couldn't explain. She started picking up the slack around the house. She cooked dinner some nights, did the laundry, and even tried to be extra attentive. But there was no denying that things had changed. It wasn't just the silence between us. It was the tension. The fact that we were both walking around on eggshells, pretending like nothing was wrong, when everything was wrong. No matter how many times she told me she was sorry or how much she tried to make amends, the pain didn't go away. I still found myself thinking about the night I'd caught her, how her face had twisted in guilt, how she tried to explain herself, how she promised she never meant to hurt me. It didn't change the fact that she had made a decision for both of us without ever considering what I might feel. She had chosen herself over me. On the other hand, there was the part of me that remembered the way we used to be, the way we fit together, like two puzzle pieces. I still wanted to believe that I could forgive her, that our marriage wasn't just a series of mistakes and missteps. I wanted to think that maybe there was a chance, some way for us to rebuild what we had. But the trust had been shattered, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. It was on a Tuesday afternoon when I was home early from work that things came to a head again. I had just walked in the door trying to make myself a quick sandwich when I heard the sound of Kelly's voice from the hallway. It was muffled at first, but I soon realized she was talking on the phone. "Yeah, I know," she said, her voice tight. "I'm trying, but I just don't know if he's ever going to forgive me. I don't think I can live with myself if he doesn't. I know it's my fault. I just never meant for any of this to happen." I froze. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the conversation felt so raw, so vulnerable, that I couldn't help myself. "I didn't think it was going to be this bad," she continued. "I just thought that one weekend would be enough, that he would be fine with it. I thought he'd get over it, but now he's acting like I'm some kind of monster. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can fix this. My chest tightened. I felt an overwhelming urge to walk away, to shut the door, and forget I'd ever heard it. But my legs wouldn't move. I stayed frozen there, caught between the desire to confront her and the part of me that still loved her, still wanted to believe that we could fix this. She was quiet for a moment, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost pleading. I've been doing everything I can. I've been giving him space. I know I've messed up, but I don't want to lose him. I don't want this to be the end of everything. I want us to have another chance. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond to her. My first instinct was to walk into the living room, to tell her I'd overheard everything, to tell her I didn't know what I was supposed to do with this information. But I didn't move. Instead, I stood there, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, like I couldn't breathe without choking on the tension. Eventually, I heard her hang up the phone, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she approached the kitchen. She must have realized I was there. There was no avoiding it. She turned the corner and stopped when she saw me standing by the counter. "Chris," she started, her voice hesitant. She glanced at me, then back down at her feet. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I just stared at her. For the first time since the whole thing had happened, I wasn't angry. I wasn't upset. I was exhausted. I was tired of fighting with myself, tired of trying to make sense of everything that had happened. "Who was that?" I finally asked, my voice sounding foreign to me. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding in until I spoke. Kelly's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she didn't hesitate. It was Emma," she said quietly, avoiding my gaze. "She's been helping me through this. I've been talking to her about what happened. She's been a good friend to me." I nodded slowly. I wasn't surprised. She'd been talking to her friends. To people who didn't know everything, people who hadn't seen what I saw, who hadn't been living with this pain day in and day out. "What did you tell her?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. "I told her everything, Chris. I told her about the weekend, about how I hurt you, how much I regret it, how much I wish I could take it back." She paused, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can fix this, but I want to try. I don't want to lose you." The vulnerability in her voice hit me hard. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something. Something like compassion. Like maybe, just maybe, she was truly sorry. But then the other part of me, the part that still hurt, reminded me that her words weren't enough. The damage had been done. "I don't know what to say, Kelly," I replied, my voice flat. "I'm not even sure what I want anymore." "I know," she whispered, taking a cautious step forward. "But I need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'll give you all the time you need." And there it was again, her desperation. The way she tried to convince me that everything could go back to the way it was, if I just gave her enough time. But I wasn't sure I could ever go back to that. I could feel my walls rising again. It wasn't that I didn't love her anymore. I did. I still cared deeply for her, but I couldn't deny that something fundamental had changed between us. I didn't know how to fix that. I didn't know if it could be fixed. "I need to think," I said finally, turning away to walk out of the kitchen. I couldn't stand there anymore, looking at her, listening to her, feeling like I was being pulled in two different directions. Kelly didn't stop me. She just stood there watching me go, the silence stretching between us, thick and heavy. The next few weeks felt like a blur, each day merging into the next as I tried to navigate the mess my life had become. Kelly did her best to act normal, but I could tell she was walking on eggshells around me, as if she expected me to snap at any moment. I wasn't angry anymore. I was numb. All the anger had burned out, leaving nothing but a cold emptiness in its wake. We barely spoke. When we did, it was about logistics, finances, work, things we couldn't avoid. Even in those moments, I could feel the distance between us, an invisible barrier that neither of us had the courage to break down. I spent most of my time at the office, staying late, working through weekends. Anything to avoid the quiet tension at home. Kelly didn't push. She didn't try to talk about us or ask how I was feeling. I think she knew there was nothing more she could say. She'd apologized 100 times, explained herself over and over, but the reality was that the trust we once had been shattered beyond repair. One evening after dinner, Kelly sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap. She'd been quieter than usual, and I could tell she was working up to something. "Chris, I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer than usual. I didn't look up. I didn't want to hear it. "You've been thinking about what?" I asked, my tone flat. "I know you need time. I know I can't rush you, but—" She paused as if struggling to find the right words. "I want you to know that I'm not giving up. Not on us. Not on you." I finally met her eyes. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I wasn't going to find it in her words. I had heard them all before. "Kelly, I don't know what you want from me. You've said that already. You've said sorry 100 times. What else is there?" Her eyes were filled with emotion, but there was no pleading, no desperation. It was almost like she was resigned to the fact that I wasn't going to give her the answer she wanted. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Chris. Not yet. But I am asking for the chance to show you that I can be better, that I can be the person you thought I was. I don't want to lose you." I felt a pang in my chest. Part of me still wanted to believe her, still wanted to find a way to make this work. But every time I thought about it, I came back to the same place. Could I trust her again? Could I ever feel the same way about her? The woman who had told me it was my turn for a hall pass, only to throw it away for some man who wasn't even worth it. "I don't know," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "I just don't know if I can trust you again, Kelly." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. She nodded, not surprised by my response, but clearly hurt by it. "I understand," she said quietly. "I do. I'll give you as much time as you need. I don't want to lose you, Chris." I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there staring at the remnants of my dinner on the plate in front of me, unsure of what the next step should be. I wasn't ready to let go of our marriage, but I wasn't ready to forgive her either. I wasn't sure how to reconcile the two. The following week, I started seeing a therapist. I didn't tell Kelly at first because, honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted her involved in it. This was for me. I had to figure out who I was, what I wanted, and whether there was any way I could move forward, either with her or without her. It was in one of those sessions that I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore, because I wasn't giving myself permission to grieve. I'd been so focused on what Kelly had done to me that I hadn't taken the time to process my own feelings, my own hurt, disappointment, and betrayal. I'd been bottling everything up, convincing myself that I had to fix the marriage, fix her, fix everything, when what I really needed was to fix myself first. I hadn't been living for me. I had been living for us, for what we once were. But the truth was, that version of us was gone, and I had to let go of it, whether Kelly was ready to or not. At first, the therapist wasn't much help. She was calm and empathetic, but she didn't seem to have any answers. I just needed someone to listen. Someone to tell me it was okay to feel the way I was feeling, to let myself be angry and hurt, without feeling like I was overreacting or being too hard on Kelly. The breakthrough came when she asked me a simple question. What do you want, Chris? Not what you think you should want. Not what Kelly wants. What do you really want? I'd never thought about it that way before. What did I want? I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if I wanted Kelly back or if I was just afraid of being alone. I wasn't sure if I still loved her or if I was clinging to a memory of her. It took time, but eventually I realized that I wasn't looking for an answer from Kelly anymore. I needed to find my own path. Whether I stayed with her or not, I had to rediscover who I was as a person, outside of our marriage. 2 months later, I walked out of the office building, my mind whirling. It was the same old routine. But something felt different. The weight that had been pressing down on me for so long felt lighter. I had finally made a decision. When I got home, Kelly was sitting on the couch, reading a book. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw the hope in her eyes. She was waiting for me. Chris, she said softly, setting the book down. Can we talk? I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. It was time. I couldn't keep delaying the inevitable. I've made a decision, I said, my voice steady but with a tinge of sadness. She looked up at me, her expression eager, almost fearful. I think it's time for us to move on, I said. Her face fell, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded. I understand, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. I'm sorry, Chris. I really am. I know, I said, my own heart heavy. I need to live my life for me. I need to figure out who I am without you. She stood slowly, walking over to where I stood. She reached for my hand, but I gently pulled it away. I'm sorry, she said again. I'll always love you. I'll always care about you too, I replied, swallowing the lump in my throat. But sometimes, loving someone means letting them go. She nodded, her tears silently falling. I didn't want to be the one to make her cry, but I knew this was the right decision. It had to be. And with that, we both walked away from what had once been, ready to face our separate futures. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that, in time, I would be okay again. Hope that I could rebuild my life, whatever that might look like. And as for Kelly, she'd find her way too. We both would. Here's the next story. Blasted it, David, I don't want to take off and lie on the blasted beach with you. I'm bored of Miami and have more important things to accomplish than go across the nation with you. Is that all you want to do anymore? We are young. We have to live it up before it's too late. I'm sick of you telling me that I can't go out with my pals. I've got a life. And if you want to share it, you must change your habits. Just because I agreed to marry you does not mean you have the right to tell me. I have to go on excursions with you or stay at home and miss out on dancing and partying with my pals. God damn it, David. I'm not a 40-year-old soccer mommy with nothing better to do than drive a bunch of kids around. I have better things to do than hang around my house and talk on the phone or BBQ on weekends. I'm young, and I want to enjoy myself. David felt his tummy nod up as he listened to his fiancée, Kathy Vanderbilt. It had taken him more than a year to recover from the end of his last relationship and the death of his parents in an automobile accident. Kathy lifted him out of his sadness and made him happy to be living again. He met her by mistake one day in the skyscraper where he worked on Wall Street. He had been late for a meeting, so she had to go. They were hurrying to the elevator, and she attempted to beat him through the door. She ran past him from behind and brushed against him, forcing both of them to drop the objects they were carrying to their rendezvous. Instead of one of them gaining the last available spot on the elevator, neither of them made it since they needed to stop and pick up their charts and briefcases. David apologized profusely and assisted her in picking up everything, despite the fact that it was her fault they had fallen their documents and briefcases. They both explained why they were late and took the next elevator. When they reached the 25th floor, David headed left for his meeting, while Kathy turned right. At that point, they had not even exchanged names. David made it to his conference room and noticed that he was not the last one to arrive. He hurriedly set up his easel and flip charts before checking to ensure that his PowerPoint presentation was correctly set up and ready to start. David's supervisor entered the room and looked around. He scowled and asked, "David?" For whatever reason, the other representative from Jones and Bancroft is late. I phoned her office and they informed me she left early enough to arrive on time. Everyone just hang loose till we figure out what the problem is. As the managing partner turned to leave the room, the woman David had run into rushed past him and into the room. She nearly knocked him down while carrying David in the elevator. She blushed as red as burgundy wine. She came to a halt just inside the room, where everyone was standing or sitting in anticipation of her arrival. She smiled slightly and continued, "I'm sorry for being late. I was hurrying for the elevator when a random person ran into me. I believe he has just fallen off the potato wagon. You could sever his hillbilly drawl with a knife. He was blocking the elevator door and knocked into me as I tried to get past him. I dropped everything I was carrying and needed to pick it up. When I reached this floor, when I exited the elevator, I got turned around and proceeded in the incorrect direction. I hope I didn't cause too many problems for you all." Mr. Goldstein, the managing partner, smiled and added, "Not a problem at all, Kathy. You're the final member of your team to arrive, and my entire team is here, so let's get started." He pointed to David and added, "This is our Vice President for New Issues, David Dyer. He'll give a brief presentation. Then we'll address any queries you might have. As far as we can tell, the publicity around your company's new bond offering, together with the coupon rate, has resulted in an oversubscription. Given the high demand for the issue, we may consider increasing the offering size or selling it at a premium. In fact, that is the primary topic we want to discuss with your team." David remembered glancing up and seeing the lovely woman standing there, staring at him with daggers. He smiled as he moved to his podium, turned to face the rest of the audience, and spoke in his finest country drawl. "Well, if everyone takes their seats, we can get started right away. Miss Vanderbilt, I'd want to apologize again for our elevator mistake. I just didn't realize how vital it was that you got to it first. After all, everyone understands that someone entering an elevator should get out of the way of a juggernaut that is about to collide with them. I suppose I should get the eyes in the back of my head tested so I can see you from now on." David waited for the laughing to settle down before beginning his presentation. He smiled inwardly as Kathy's face flushed with shame. He knew he shouldn't have said what he did, but he was tired of self-important individuals wielding their influence. She acted like the majority of the other ladies he encountered in the city. She came out as arrogant and demanding, and he disliked that type of lady. After moving to New York, he had 2 women who were like that, and he was over it. Sometimes he pondered why he wanted to leave the farm. No amount of money was worth the effort. He went through several days. He was displeased with the city for a variety of reasons. He was raised to think that success was earned through hard labor. Here, in the city, it appeared that you succeeded by backstabbing your friends and co-workers, making the competition look terrible, rather than working to make yourself look good. He despised the phony friendships and camaraderie, as well as the required parties, and social activities. Truthfully, he was about to quit his miserable job and return home, where he could live a wonderful life with real people. He had saved enough money to invest. He could live comfortably with a lower-paying job in his hometown. David smiled as he began his presentation. He had the figures in order, and like many Wharton MBAs, he knew his subject inside and out. He often noticed shock and appreciation in his audience's eyes as he answered their queries. One of the individuals from the bond-issuing company was a sniper. David could see his rage simmering beneath the surface. As he turned away, his verbal barbs and responses made him seem horrible. David felt his presentation went well, and his boss appeared to agree. Finally, everyone agreed on the proposed revisions to the offering. They directed the responsible parties to complete and file the necessary papers and have the issue placed. Kathy remained seated after the meeting ended. She pretended to organize her paperwork and place them back in her briefcase. She was really slow and methodical. It was clear she was postponing her departure. Finally, she and David were the only ones in the room. She stood up and faced him. David watched as she approached him with a guilty, infantile expression on her face. When she drew close to him, she paused and softly placed her hand on his forearm. "Mr. Dyer, I apologize for how I behaved when we ran into each other, and when I entered the room today. I know I acted like a 304, and I sincerely apologize. I was really nervous. I lingered too long at my workplace. Then I couldn't obtain a taxi. When I arrived, I dashed to the elevator and attempted to brush past you so I wouldn't have to wait for another one. I caused the problems, and I didn't have the decency to admit it when I arrived. Please, since it is past leaving time, may I take you out for a drink to make amends?" David had every intention of telling her to forget it and walking out of the room. He astonished himself when he heard his voice consenting to accompany her. That was the beginning of their romance. It was after 2 a.m. When he stumbled into his apartment that evening, he was smitten with Kathy Vanderbilt. He had discovered she was a distant relative of the Vanderbilts and a very motivated woman. They exchanged addresses and phone numbers that evening. Kathy had committed to a date the following Friday before they parted ways that night. Over the next year, David discovered Kathy was a party animal and socialite, just like his prior New York girlfriends. She was high maintenance. He attempted several times to break it off, but was unable to do so. He was in love. Despite his hatred for some of Kathy's preferences and desires, as well as her habits and demeanor, her behavior and remarks made it clear that she felt superior to many of the people with whom she was compelled to contact. He was embarrassed several times when they were out because of how she treated the individuals who served them. Despite her numerous flaws, David felt empty when she wasn't around him. He couldn't have enough of her. She was very unique when she laughed and flirted with him, when she adored him. Finally, he realized he needed all of her all the time. So he asked her to marry him. Much to his amazement, she paused. They had been in love for 9 months and had been living together for 6. She claimed to love him, but it took her nearly a week to agree to marry him, and he had to ask her several times before she finally sighed and said, "Okay, I'll marry you." Geez, you whine like a young boy. David was offended by her comment after she accepted his proposal. He still didn't know why he let it go, but Kathy had become increasingly unpleasant to be with during the last 3 months. She refused to remain at home with him several evenings. She wouldn't even get home until after midnight. Other evenings, she would return home from work, clean up, change clothes, and go out with her pals for a variety of reasons. David was practically never invited to join her anymore since she called him a spoiler. She was rarely willing to travel any place he wanted to go or visit anyone he wanted to see. She once said, "Honestly, I'm not sure why I put up with your country attitude. This is the Big Apple country boy. Get a life. Go out, party, and live a little." David earned the nickname Spoil Sport because he objected to the way she danced and behaved with many of the men she met at the bars during an affair she or they attended. He informed her that she was engaged and that her behavior in bars and with her friends was inappropriate for either an engaged or married lady. Of course, that was one of the reasons he had been excluded from her recent nights out. He'd watched her a few times and had never seen her do something completely ridiculous. However, several of her activities made him uncomfortable as a fiancé. Many of the behaviors he found appealing and endearing during their early romance made him uncomfortable because she continued to flirt and use them with other guys. David shook himself and turned away from his recollections to address his fiancée, Kathy. He felt his lips pulled together and his jaw pinched. He forced himself to relax. Then he started speaking. He said, "Kathy, you've been acting like a spoiled brat and a selfish woman for 3 months now. We need this time apart to reconnect and unwind. I understand that we both have high-pressure jobs that need us to work long hours, but we can't keep doing this. It's only 6 weeks till our wedding, and we need to reconnect with each other to discover whether this is indeed our dream. This week, we need to figure out how to fix our relationship. I'm afraid it won't last if you don't modify your perspective. In fact, I'm not sure we're not irreversibly damaged now. When you decided to go last week, I made all of the reservations. Heck, you even packed your suitcase yesterday. And now you say you're not going. The limo will arrive any time. We are going, and we will settle this once and for all." David took Kathy's hand and walked her to the front entrance of their condo. He gave her the suitcase she was using. He approached the door, opened it, took up his luggage and her overnight bag, and escorted her out. When he went to shut the door, he noticed the limo waiting and the driver assisting Kathy into the rear. David approached the driver, handed him the luggage he was holding, and began to enter the limousine. He overheard Kathy on her cell phone during all of this, stating he was being a complete jerk about the whole situation. "I've got enough of his nonsense. Yeah, that is a good concept. I am looking forward to it." Kathy smiled and proceeded. "Great. See you there. At the very least, this week will yield some results for me." Kathy looked up at David, angry as she closed her phone. She did not say anything while they went to the airport. The entire flight to Miami was silent. Kathy only spoke when absolutely necessary. David felt his rage grow until he could scarcely contain it. He was willing to concede that this was a horrible decision and that his marriage might never happen. He decided that if she didn't modify her attitude over the following few days, he'd ask for his ring back and call it off. He refused to put up with the garbage Kathy was throwing out. When they arrived at their resort and settled up, David suggested they go out to eat and dance. Kathy's eyes brightened up and she smiled big when she heard the word dance. She readily agreed and inquired where they were heading. David told her and then suggested she go clean up. Then he'd shower while she got dressed. David entered the bedroom after taking a shower and overheard Kathy on the phone. She said yes. "Supper. Following that, we'll go to the beach club to dance." "Oh, yes. I am looking forward to it." Kathy laughed and said, "Yeah, doing it like this is so exciting. I can't wait to watch his expression when it goes down. I get so excited doing it this way that it makes the entire grueling process worthwhile. Almost. Well, see you when we return." David felt slightly better when he heard her say she was looking forward to the night. He felt some of the knots in his body loosen, so he returned to the sitting room to complete dressing while waiting for Kathy. He wondered what she was so thrilled about. Kathy's chat suggests she is arranging a surprise for him. He hoped so. The conversation at the meal was tense, but rather nice. Kathy appeared to be looking forward to the dancing, which pleased David. She also mentioned that she was looking forward to the night after the dance and the rest of the week. They got to the club and did a few dances. Kathy was asked to dance once or twice by other males. She was always nice, asking if she could. David reluctantly gave his approval. By the end of the evening, Kathy and one of the men had given up asking him whether she may dance with the stranger. She was almost dividing her attention between David and another tall, well-built male. David was unhappy about it, first because the man seemed somewhat familiar, and secondly because they appeared far too interested in each other, far too familiar with each other. Finally, about 1 a.m., David persuaded Kathy to return to the resort. When they arrived, they washed together to remove the smoke before retiring to their beds. David had to almost force his way into the shower with Kathy, but she eventually relaxed and appeared to enjoy his company. David knew from previous experience that if he could ever get Kathy started, she was a sex machine. They had sex in the shower before they were done washing themselves. After drying themselves, David and Kathy staggered to their bed. They proceeded to love on the bed. After a few minutes of kissing, nibbling, and small chat, they made love again. David felt encouraged and moved to cuddle against Kathy's back. David smiled since Kathy appeared to be much more prepared for lovemaking. She felt more enthused than she had in weeks. He was slightly offended when she attempted to walk away from him after they had finished. She had not complained about him cuddling up to her, and she appeared to fall asleep while resting in his arms. Kathy used to snuggle after they had sex when their relationship was still new. David was concerned about her attitude, but he let it go as he fell asleep. The next morning, David woke up late. He looked at the clock. It was after 10 a.m. Kathy wasn't in bed. He stepped naked into the condo's sitting area, but she was not present. After a more thorough check, he discovered her pocketbook was also missing. Finally, he concluded that she had gone out for brunch or something. Aside from being concerned, he was upset. She could have waited for him or even woke him up if she was in a hurry. He sighed and thought to himself, "This is just another sign that things are going badly wrong." She would not have done this. We were inseparable a few weeks ago, constantly waiting for one other for breakfast on weekends or during trips. I have a lot more repairs to undertake than I expected. As the day progressed, David became increasingly upset. Kathy didn't call. She did not return for lunch. David assumed she had gone shopping, but she did not return for supper. He stayed up past midnight, and she still hadn't returned. Finally, he contacted the police, but they had no information about her. He was informed that he could not declare her missing for at least 24 hours. He had a sleepless night. Kathy was still missing the next morning, so David reported her to the police. He gritted his teeth and phoned her parents. David was astonished when her father said, "Oh, don't worry about it, David. I am sure everything is all right. Why don't you simply enjoy your trip and unwind?" Kathy was laying on her back, giggling in another hotel room down the block from David's while he was chatting to her father. Kathy turned to face the man in bed with her after hearing David on the phone with her father. She drew him up and gave him a deep, sensual kiss. He smiled as he felt her pull him over her for the third time that day. The tall blonde man loathed David, despite the fact that he knew nothing about him. He'd toiled his entire life to get successful, and he despised people like David, and, in fact, like Kathy. He believed he had struggled for what he had, whereas they had it handed to them because they were from a good family or college. Kathy was not the first woman he had stolen from guys like David, but if she was as wealthy as he suspected, she would be the last for some time. He really intended to marry her and enjoy the life to which he felt entitled. When a wealthier woman came along, he would trade up. He only hoped he wasn't required to sign a prenuptial agreement when he married Kathy. He had been dating her for some months and was confident that when the time came, she would agree to marry him. After all, hadn't he rescued her from the hole she was engaged to? David stayed in Miami for the entire week as planned, expecting to learn more about Kathy. He repeatedly called her parents and all of her friends' phone numbers, hoping to hear from her. When he approached some of Kathy's pals, they were evasive, if not abrupt. Many people did not answer their phones. He had no luck locating her. Most of the folks he called said they had no idea they had left town. Finally, the Thursday morning before he was to fly home, David called her parents again to say he still didn't know anything. That morning, he was astonished to discover her parents furious with his call. The first morning, they had been as frantic as he had been with the calls he made following his first report of her disappearance. They had been strained, and he decided they were concerned enough. They were not themselves. One of her pals chuckled when he called to inquire about Kathy. She then commented, "Well, that sounds like Kathy." She immediately hung up the phone. David packed both suitcases and returned to New York. When he packed Kathy's bag, he was surprised to discover that she had brought almost no cosmetics, only some of her older clothes and swimwear. When he returned to work, he looked like hell. He was completely ineffective. His supervisor asked what the issue was, and when he told him, he laughed. All he would say was, "Welcome to the club, boy." After returning to New York, he contacted all of Kathy's friends he could find. Some of them glanced or said they were sorry, but none of them appeared particularly concerned about Kathy. Many of them refused to look him in the eye when he spoke to them, and many of them appeared guilty when he saw them in person. He even called Kathy's employer, who apologized, but couldn't tell him anything about her. This sentence annoyed him. He was never passed on by the operator. It was almost as if they were expecting his call and had been instructed to run interference when he attempted to phone her desk directly. He received a voicemail message indicating that Miss Vanderbilt is now away from her desk. Please leave a message following the beep. He left a message, but his call was not returned. Finally, David decided to monitor Kathy's office. The third evening, he stood outside, monitoring the door. His heart broke. He felt himself burning from the fire of his wrath. Kathy stepped out the door, accompanied by a tall, well-built, blonde man. Her arms were wrapped around his left arm, and she was looking up into his eyes as they walked. When they came to a halt to hail a cab, she stood on tiptoes and kissed him deeply. David recognized him as the man she'd been dancing with. Their first night in Miami. He knew Kathy had moved on, just like the other high-maintenance city ladies did. David rushed quickly up to Kathy and her new man. He grabbed her arm and twisted it towards him. He wasn't particularly violent, but he wasn't nice with her either. David stared at Kathy and said, "Are you cheating, little 304? I sensed something was wrong, but you could have had the grace to terminate our engagement in person rather than walking away and leaving me to worry for almost a week." David grabbed her hand and removed his engagement ring over Kathy's objections. She started screaming and attempting to close her fist to keep the ring. Kathy said, "You asshole, I'm tired up with your moaning and complaining. Why wouldn't I go on to a man who is more compatible with my lifestyle? Now, take your hands off me. That is my ring, and I plan to retain it. You gave it to me, and I have no intention of returning it to you." Kathy's new lover had recovered by this point and pushed David away from her. David turned to him and said, "Back off a hole. You may be taller than me, but I will tear you apart if you don't stop messing with me. I should beat you to a pulp anyway for what you did." The man took a step back and watched David finish taking the ring from Kathy. He looked at her and her new partner and said, "I knew when I first saw you that no sane man should be involved with you, but I just couldn't help myself. I suppose I got what I deserved." David took a slow walk back to the parking garage and his car. He mentally kicked himself because he knew Kathy was like that. He'd witnessed her selfishness, how self-centered she had been throughout their courtship and engagement. But she refused to accept it. He knew without a doubt that he was nothing more than a fling for another conceited party girl. He was angry. He hired a private investigator, PI. Follow her and gather information for him. She had already moved into the home of her new lover. They managed to get photos of them making love. David boxed up Kathy's belongings, which had been left in his home, while he was packing them. He noticed there wasn't as much as he expected. Nothing he discovered was of any significance to her. Only old clothing. There were no important personal items or business papers left in his house. He then realized she had returned home while he was worried about her and taken what she wanted from his house, leaving her old, outdated items as she had at the resort. As he considered Kathy's actions, David's anger grew. He was dissatisfied with his job and the people he worked with. He was sick of New York and everyone who lived and worked there. He decided to quit his work, sell his condominium, and return to his childhood home. It wouldn't be the same with his entire family gone, but he still had pals there. He still had a score to settle with Kathy and her new man before leaving, but other than that, he had no reason to stay in New York. Hell, he'd even earned enough money. When he returned home, he was able to live comfortably. David resolved to inform Kathy's friends and parents about what she had done to him. Hopefully, he could create enough of a controversy to ruin her reputation. Perhaps he could prevent another man from going through what he did. Then, when his condo sold, he would resign his job and go. Much to David's surprise, when he started hunting up her friends and family to inform them what Kathy had done, they laughed at him. Almost all of her pals acknowledged to already knowing how she dumped him. Haley, one of her female friends who was kinder to David than most, apologized for not informing him when he first called. She remarked, "David, I'm sorry this happened to you and I understand how you're hurt." But she let it drop. "Kathy, this is just typical. You are not the first man she has ditched like that. One time, she traveled to France with a man. I spent a week with him before cutting off contact. This is her typical method of ending a relationship. She can stop when she decides she's had enough. She frequently finds a new man, moves in with him, and then abruptly ends her relationship with her previous partner. She frequently does it on trips, just as she did with you. That appears to be her preferred method of ending a relationship. I believe she enjoys seeing or learning about her ex's breakdown, believing she has been mistreated or kidnapped. Most dumped guys disappear for an extended period of time, just like you did while searching for her. That allows her time to grab what she wants from their flat, move, and start covering her tracks. We all know not to spill the beans on her since she may be so vengeful. One of her co-workers informed the man she was dumping that she had left him before Kathy completed moving the personal belongings she desired from his apartment. Kathy worked for months to create a pretext for her employer to fire the tattletale. We're all terrified to turn her in. I apologize, but I couldn't take the chance and inform you. My advice to you is to drop it and go forward. She has many friends all throughout the place, and if you cause her any trouble, she will make your life very unpleasant. She has a stable of men and powerful settings where she makes love on a regular basis. When she asks for assistance, these men rush to help her so she does not cut them off or tell their wives. She is currently happy and content, knowing what she caused to you and how much you suffered. Don't irritate her or she will retaliate against you. If she can't injure you to her liking, she'll ask some of her powerful lovers to do it for her." When David heard that, he exclaimed, "You're kidding." It looked like it was. I can't believe Kathy would do that. I admit I was beginning to suspect she was doing more than just going out with her buddies, but I still can't believe she had lovers throughout our engagement. Believe it. Romeo. I can't provide proof, but all of her friends have seen her with other men during her dating and engagements. Kathy is looking out for herself, and anything that would improve her situation is acceptable. She will never date or have sex with a man unless she believes she has something to gain. Her goal is to reclaim her family's previous wealth, and she is well on her way. I know from speaking with her that you spent a lot of money on her, giving her jewelry, fancy clothes, trips, and so on. She spent very little of her own money while living with you. She boasted that you opened a joint account with her so she could pay home bills, and so on. Did you ever wonder why so much money vanished? I bet it wasn't spent, lover. David felt unwell. He considered what Haley said and knew she was correct. He was continuously required to deposit more money into the account. He complained. Kathy had merely brushed him off, saying things were more expensive now. He was happy now. He did not deposit his entire paycheck into that account, where she could have spent or taken it all. David realized it was a waste of time, and continued to tell her relatives and friends what Kathy had done. Everyone was aware of Kathy's actions, and didn't seem to care. David hired a public relations firm to follow Kathy. He followed her for a month and inquired about the men and women she had sex with during that time period. He bought an old computer and started emailing photos of Kathy and her boyfriends to everyone he knew who knew her. He always utilized public Wi-Fi connections, so the message could not be traced back to him. He sent images of her naked and in compromising postures. Whenever possible, he provided images and explanations to her boyfriend's wives or girlfriends. If he didn't have their email addresses, he utilized regular mail. David started hearing about marital and interpersonal problems in many families who knew Kathy. She was now the most popular gossip subject among people who knew her or knew of her. Many of her pals avoided her, hoping not to be splattered by the shitstorm she had created. Kathy had been with the man who had replaced him for about 6 months and was growing tired of him. She was once again looking for a new man. David caught her and photographed her doing inappropriate things such as petting and once having intercourse with another man in public. These photos were emailed to his contact list. He ensured that copies of the photos were sent to her new partner. He appears to have become very angry with Kathy. In fact, he hit her and wound up in jail for it. David thought that was poetic justice. Kathy's life began to disintegrate whenever she was spotted with another man. He received a description of her previous activities several times. Many of them dropped her outright. Others only used her for sex. Then, when she hinted at moving in with him, they dumped her. Kathy was upset that someone would trash her like way, but she couldn't figure out who was doing it. She and her family even hired a PI, but had little success. Finally, she lost her job after David discovered her having sex with 2 of her bosses and one of her subordinates on work time. Even worse, she was doing it at company offices or at company events. She had to move back into her parents' house. David felt he'd had enough with Kathy. He sent her 1 more box, including duplicates of the majority of the photos and notices he had given to others. The note at the top told it all. You've screwed over countless men and made their life terrible by using them to make yourself feel better or improve your position. You now not only understand how it feels, but you have also been forced to rely on your parents once more. I hope you have a wonderful life. Getting back at the man who had stolen Kathy from him was much easier. David thought that he didn't need to do much to him because he had been used, as had many others. If Kathy hadn't been wearing his engagement ring, David might have said goodbye to the man. He followed him into a bar one night, and after he was half drunk, David approached his table and sat down uninvited. David extended his hand to shake. He stated, "You may not remember me, but I owe you a lot for what you did for me. I'd like to thank you." The man took his hand and stated, "I don't think I even know you. What do you think I did to aid you?" David laughed and added, "Hell, fella, you moved in on me and stole my fiancée, Kathy Vanderbilt, 6 weeks before my wedding. I can't thank you enough for removing that cheating, lying 304 from my hands before I made a grave mistake and married her. Unfortunately, you didn't last as long as I did. She was one of the greatest pieces of meat I've ever eaten." The young man rose from his chair with a yell as recognition flashed across his face. He struck David, causing him to tumble off his chair before the other customers. The bouncers may reach him through his buddies. David stood and struck him 3 times. His first punch was a kick to the gonads, but David bent forward and smashed his knee into the young man's face, holding himself as he began to fall. David slapped him as hard as he could in the face. He heard his jaw snap. David bent down toward the man who was laying on the floor, moaning and grasping himself. He said, "I'm sorry, old chap. All I wanted to say was thank you for removing that skank from my hands. I'm pleased she's gone, but you should remember this. If you ever intend to hurt another engaged or married woman, but if you hadn't punched me first, I wouldn't have been so harsh on you. I hope you have learned your lesson." David walked out of the building before the bouncer could stop him, and before the cops arrived the next morning, he read about a fight at a popular local nightclub. Jeff Dwight was reportedly attacked and severely beaten by an unknown assailant who fled. David waited for a police visit, but one never arrived. He felt happy, sad about his separation, but relieved he didn't end himself in jail. A few weeks later, his condo sold on the same day, so he gave his notice and resigned his work. 2 weeks later, David loaded what little he was carrying into his car and drove back to his home in the Missouri Ozarks. He was the last of his direct family, and he wanted to leave the city. He hadn't gone back to the family farm in about a decade, but it was his destination, and he was looking forward to getting there. He had no plans to leave his hometown for more than a vacation ever again. His family had owned the property since 1882, and he inherited it after his parents died several years ago. He was an only child, so he added the worth of their tiny estate to the money he'd earned from his job. He hadn't been like the majority of the other high-profile MBAs working on Wall Street. Instead of indulging in conspicuous consumption for instant gratification, he had saved and invested a considerable portion of his salary and bonuses. That, too, had been a source of difficulty for him and his 3 departed loves. They wanted to spend everything they and he had saved to live a happy life. Conspicuous consumption was the key to their hearts. When you ran out of cash, borrow, borrow, borrow. The wonderful thing about how he saved money was that after selling his condo and paying all of his payments, he had slightly more than $3.75 million in assets. This excludes the worth of his modest farm. He may return home and become a hermit, living off the interest. David's one indulgence to excess was the purchase of a superb Super Crew F-250 Power Stroke 4x4. Of course, this was another point of dispute with Kathy. She protested about him owning a truck since it was uncool. She refused to be seen with him in it. She claimed that for the same money he could have bought a nice car, such as a BMW, a Mercedes, or even a Lexus. When he bought it, she was shocked that a dusty old truck cost about $60,000. He had almost sold it several times due to difficulty driving and parking in the city. Now he was pleased he had preserved it. He piled all of his belongings into it, along with a tiny utility trailer, and drove home. When he left his work, he told no one where he was heading, and no one in his former village knew he was coming, except for a small 30-acre area along the riverbed. David's land has been barren since his grandparents died 10 years ago. He had a local farmer watch after the property and utilize it for pasture as recompense. The original house burned down around 5 years ago. The only building that remained was an almost new pole barn. It was well after dark when David drove into his ancestral land, his new home. He drove under the barn and shut off the truck. He dragged enough out of the rear to construct a bed and fell asleep. Over the next 3 days, David relaxed by the river that ran through his farm and contemplated what to do with his life. He finally resolved to merely exist, manage his finances, and see what happens. With that in mind, he realized he needed a warmer location to sleep in the winter and a cool place to sleep in the summer if the weather was typical. David decided to pour cement on the barn floor and build a tiny living room at one end. He'd have a garage and shop at the opposite end. He could connect to the old well and septic system of the burned-out house. He didn't need much and chose to handle the majority of the work himself. It would keep him occupied while also providing entertainment. One of David's first jobs was to buy a 60-horsepower tractor and loader so he could clean up the property after he had accomplished the work. Do you want to establish a community and buy lumber and pipes so that he can install drains and water lines? After that, he filled out the paperwork for the cement floor and had the local ready-mix company pour it. He did employ a local cement constructor to assist smooth out the concrete floor so it was level. David was fortunate that there were no zoning or building codes to worry about in the country. He possessed all the knowledge required to do his own work. When he was younger, he worked with his parents and grandparents on repairs and modest construction. His father owned a small building and contracting company, and David had worked there in the summers, so he knew how to wire, plumb, and build his modest home. The barn stood tall enough. He could expand the living space to 2 stories. He added 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a small sitting area on the upper level. Downstairs, he had a huge living area, kitchen, and dining room, as well as the master suite and bathroom. He added a utility room and a tiny office as a single-story expansion behind the kitchen at the barn's garage end. David felt himself relax over the course of several weeks. He also felt himself becoming more physically fit as he worked and used muscles he hadn't used in the city. David would occasionally visit one of the neighboring towns, either Prineville, the nearest little town and county seat, or Steeleville, which was significantly larger. He'd go grocery shopping, eat at the neighborhood cafe on occasion, and, of course, buy building supplies. He even rewarded himself with canoe outings along the nearby river. He fished while watching the city slickers make fools of themselves. As a red-blooded male, he admired the scantily clothed women playing in and around the river. David became well known enough that local farmers who met at the cafe would occasionally nod and speak to him, but not enough to consider him a friend. David didn't want to be anybody's friend. He specifically did not want to be anyone's boyfriend. He avoided any interactions with the few servers and other local ladies who attempted to see him. He became a popular topic of conversation among those women. They began to investigate where he lived, what he did, and, most importantly, whether he was married, as he was a fine example of a man. Prineville was located on a huge river, and there were numerous fishing camps, lodges, and canoe rental enterprises along its length from Steeleville to Prineville. The river that ran alongside his property was slow-moving, and just 3 miles downstream, it transformed into a magnificent lake. The majority of the outfitters were tiny, family-run companies. David had many memories of floating and fishing in the river as a child. Those were good times, fun times. He planned to buy a canoe next summer, or better yet, get a John boat and go on some trips. instead of renting like he did the few times he went on the river this summer. He would also have a huge garden and possibly a few livestock to help him become as self-sufficient as possible. This year, all he had time for was constructing his home and preparing for winter. The summer went very slowly, but way too quickly. Building a house inside a pole barn didn't make for a very attractive facade, but the interior could have been found in any high-end New York condo. The bathrooms and kitchen had tile floors, but the rest of the rooms had deep carpets and solid wood paneling. The kitchen featured stainless equipment and granite worktops. In short, absolute luxury. Despite this, David did the majority of the work himself, thus the pricing was reasonable. He constructed a covered porch across the end of the structure and down both sides. The main bedroom was located on the east side. David glassed in the area of the porch next to the master suite. He installed a hot tub so that he could utilize it all year round. During this time, David continued to take days off to canoe the nearby stream. He occasionally leased a boat to fish on the local lake, but he preferred the stream. David became friends with many of the folks who leased canoes and boats on the river. There was one chap in Prineville who he couldn't warm up to. However, it appears that not many people could, as he almost always had canoes available to rent. He was always the last place you visited to rent a boat since he was mean, and his place was filthy. He employed 2 young women, one of whom he treated poorly. She was tiny and constantly wore ragged clothes. He made her perform the dirtiest, most difficult job, while the other woman dressed well and did the cleaner work. David checked around and discovered that the nicer-looking older woman was the man's sister, and she was married to the younger skinny girl's brother. They had taken the girl into their home after her parents died. The brother was now serving in Iraq as part of the army. David wasn't stupid. He inquired around. He studied people and quickly realized that the young girl's brother's wife was sleeping around. She was a flirter and an adulteress. She reminded David of a country example of his New York girlfriends. She and her brother clearly didn't care about either of their siblings, as the entire community seemed to know Karen was cheating on John. He assumed a divorce was imminent. He felt sad for John and Patricia, the younger girl. Patricia was a breath of fresh air for David. She was always polite and smiled when he spoke to her, unless Jared or Karen were bothering her once more. Even so, she was kinder than David could have been. He was also impressed since she worked hard. When David discovered she was not being paid, he became more pleased with her and upset with Jared and Karen. Patricia's clothes were shabby, and she appeared disheveled. She didn't have any money to buy stuff for herself. David began going to Jared's marina first, simply so he could speak with Patricia. He disliked giving them money, but that was the only way he could communicate with Patricia, who drove the canoes to the river's put-in site. He was able to talk to her on the rides as well, if he was very lucky. He was the only customer in the vehicle, so he could sit in the cab with her. He found himself taking more float trips than he should have just to have an excuse to talk to Patricia. He always made sure to leave her a larger tip so she would have some money. She initially refused it, but when he began leaving it in her seat after she exited the truck, she ultimately consented to accept it. She was always slightly embarrassed to accept it, but very grateful. David rarely saw Patricia in town, but when he did, he generally tried to persuade her to have a Coke or coffee with him. She did this several times. Finally, the summer came to an end, and the weather became too cool to paddle. David found himself spending more time in the woods, cutting and splitting wood to burn for winter heat. He had installed a wood stove in his new home and wanted to use it as frequently as possible, mostly because he favored wood heat He had cut some wood early after his arrival so that it could season and dry in time to burn well in the winter. He was now working on his next year's supply and thoroughly enjoying himself. David was working by the stream when he heard a cry. He looked up to see Patricia in a canoe paddling toward the shore where he stood. She landed the canoe and trotted over to him. She smiled and asked, "Hello, David. What are you doing here?" "Cutting wood." "I've heard that this land is owned by a wealthy New Yorker who does not want anyone on it. Old Hiram runs his cattle here, chasing away everybody he can catch." David started telling her he owned the place, but then changed his mind. After all, he didn't know her very well, despite enjoying flirting with her while canoeing. "Oh, I share an inn with Hiram. I maintain the site clean and get to take the wood home to burn when I cut it." "What are you doing on the river? When is it this cold outside?" Jared demanded me come out and look for any of his belongings, renters lost. "I'm also taking down some of his posters and belongings to store for the winter. He charges for lost stuff. When they return, if they are found, he does not reimburse the customer's money. He makes a lot of money selling lost items for new prices. I get to come out here and get wet and freeze my buttocks off, while he and Karen relax at home in a warm room and drink beer. I wish I could get away from the a-hole," John laments after he returns from Iraq. "We'll get away from the jerk and his 304. He's attempting to file for divorce from the cheating skank, but doing so long distance is impossible. She receives a portion of his salary and an allocation, which she subsequently uses to assist Jared in her lover's life. I could simply murder her." "Yeah, I've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. That is why I moved back from New York." David noticed Patricia's head jerk up and stare at him as he said it. Then she started speaking. He spoke first, saying, "Shit. I guess I'm busted now, right? I was engaged to a damn trash like Karen. She abandoned me for an unknown amount of time. Finally, only 6 weeks before the wedding, she abandoned me in Miami and fled with her current partner. I understand how your brother feels." Patricia was looking at David with an angry expression on her face. She asked, "Why are you trying to make me believe that someone else owned this place? Why did you hide here?" "Well, I suppose I don't have a good excuse. I don't know, Patricia. I apologize. I suppose I just wasn't thinking. It's really competitive in the city. That information is powerful, and you try to keep everything to yourself. I think I still haven't gotten all that dirt and deception out of my system. I apologize." "Oh, I suppose that's fine. I really have no business interfering with your affairs. So, what are you going to do with this place? Last I heard, the home had burned down, leaving only an old pole barn." David gazed at Patricia for a time before saying, "Come with me and I'll show you." He turned and picked up his tools, placing them in the back of his truck. It was only about 1/8 of a mile to the home, but he drove to bring back some of the wood he had chopped. David opened the truck door and said, "Hop in, Patricia." "I will not bite. I've ridden with you enough. You should know I am safe." Patricia smiled and stepped into the cab of David's truck. She looked around and commented, "Wow, these new Super Cruise are really nice, aren't they?" "So, where do we go?" David pointed through the windshield at the barn house, saying, "Oh, right up there." I suppose we could have walked, but I was about to give up and wanted to return with my load of wood and tools. David drove the truck to the back of the building and parked it near a large mound of already split wood. He got out and waited for Patricia before leading her to the door that led into his utility room, then into the kitchen, which was located in the barn garage area of the building. Patricia paused in the kitchen and gazed. She said, "Oh my gosh, This is beautiful. What inspired you to transform a portion of a barn into something so beautiful? Patricia headed directly into the kitchen. She ran her hands gently over the granite counters while staring at the stainless steel equipment. After another adoring look at the kitchen, she stepped into the living room and came to a halt. She spun in a circle, her eyes gleaming. She addressed David and said, "Oh, David, this is perfect." David offered her a guided tour of the entire house, beginning with the master suite and progressing to the upstairs. He explained how he could drain the water from the upstairs bathroom and shut off those rooms when he didn't want to heat or cool them. Following the tour, he led her to the enclosed hot tub area. She appeared very impressed with David's wood heating stove in that room, especially when he described how it was connected to the household heating system to heat the entire house. They sat on chairs around a patio table, sipping iced tea and chatting. Patricia glanced quickly at her watch. She jumped up and yelled, "Oh no, I was scheduled to be at the takeout location in 15 minutes for Jared to pick me up. Even if I paddle as hard as I can, it will take me about an hour to make it. I have to go. Thank you for the tour and drink. I'll see you around town, I suppose." Patricia whirled and dashed out the door for the creek and her beached boat. David simply gazed as she vanished in a rush. Throughout the winter, David maintained track of his investments, purchasing and selling stocks as he planned for the coming year. He knew he wanted a large garden for his own use, and because he enjoyed gardening, he decided to plant extra and see if he could sell it. He ordered his seeds and made arrangements with the local garden center to have them start the tomato and pepper plants he intended to cultivate. David occasionally ran across Patricia in town, and they talked. He discovered that her brother's unit had been extended in Iraq and would not return to the States until midsummer. Patricia stated that her life with Jared and Karen was growing worse. Karen seldom worked anymore, and Jared did very little. Of course, nothing much needed to be done throughout the winter, except upkeep. Her financial situation has deteriorated. In late March, people began returning to the river on nice days to enjoy the spring from the boat. Of course, Patricia started working more. David chose to go for a float trip on a pleasant day before becoming bogged down in the spring and summer's labor while she was transporting him in his canoe. To put it simply, Patricia and he paid a visit. David said, "I don't think I'll see you much for a while. I'm going to plant a large garden, maybe even enough for a produce market. I guess I'm going to get my own canoe or John boat." David was looking at Patricia while he spoke, and he noticed a flood of sadness on her face. She said, "I'll miss talking to you. Maybe I will see you in town. Still, I'd really like to speak with you." The following Tuesday, David was working in his garden plot when he heard a paddle strike the side of a canoe. A bit later, he heard someone yell his name from the riverbank. He glanced toward the sound and saw Patricia approaching him from where she had beached her boat. He could tell she was angry by the look on her face. He'd never seen her expression so stormy as it was today. David approached her and said, "Hello, Patricia. It's nice to see you. Why don't we move over to the chairs?" David had some comfortable lawn chairs set up under a tree by the river to rest for a while. David picked up the cooler he normally carried to the garden or woods as he passed past it. When they reached the chairs, he sat down and opened the cooler. He turned to Patricia and stated, "I have water. While you have it, drink a Pepsi or a beer." Patricia began to speak after they had started drinking their beverages. "David, I apologize for bothering you, but I needed to go away for a while, and you were the only person I could think of to talk to. That skank has moved in with her boyfriend, and they make kissy faces or have sex when there's work to be done. It's horrible what she's doing to my brother, and I get really irritated occasionally. I assume she's making more noise than usual to let me know she's having sex again. I just can't handle how she's poking my nose in her business, knowing there's nothing my brother or I can do about it. Aside from that, Jared has been allowing his hands to roam more than normal. I've been looking for a job, but no one is hiring, and I don't have the money or transportation to get to the city where I would have a better chance. Besides, who would hire someone with only a high school diploma today? I apologize for unloading on you, but you have been so kind in the past. I think of you as a friend. You might be my sole friend in this town. Patricia broke down in tears. Then, with effort, she pulled herself together. She dried her eyes and looked over to David. She drew a big breath, licked her lips, and began. I was pondering yesterday night. You said to me a while ago that you were considering purchasing a canoe or John boat for yourself, and this sparked an idea. David, you're not too far out of town, and so I was wondering whether you bought a dozen canoes and a couple of John boats. I mean, if you had that much money, I could rent them to you and manage that aspect of the business. I know where we can buy a trailer to tow the canoes as well as an ice machine for selling drinks and other items. I could help you with the garden and keep the house. So, David, I really want to get away from them assholes, and I believe we can make money. I wouldn't need much money if I could just stay in your garage while we worked. David sat stunned, seeing Patricia's emotions play out on her face. He opened his mouth numerous times to speak, but no words emerged. Patricia finally frowned, and he saw fresh tears fall from the corner of her eyelids. She said, "Bad idea. I apologize. I was simply hoping because I really want to get away." She groaned and replied, "Well, I suppose I should go. I'll need to paddle back upstream, and that is a long pole. Sorry for bothering you." Patricia had up and begun to walk away before David could raise his voice. He eventually croaked out, "Wait, Patricia. Come back in a minute. I apologize. You really astonished me. I simply didn't know what to say for a moment. I think I can help you. Let us chat about it." Patricia returned to the shade and sat once more. She stared at David in disbelief. Her eyes sparkled, and her grin couldn't grow any bigger. Did she actually squeak out? In an enthusiastic tone of voice. David's expression got very serious. He chewed his lip and furrowed his brow in thought. He appeared very serious, even predatory. Patricia had never seen such an expression on his face. It had almost scary intensity. She trembled, thinking she never wanted him to be upset with her. David finally began to speak. He answered, "Patricia, I had never considered anything like that. I never meant my garden to be much more than a hobby and a source of food for the winter. I prefer fresh, homegrown, and home-preserved food than store-bought options. I enjoy growing it and know how to can and freeze food. So I chose to cultivate my own and preserve what I anticipate needing for the winter. I decided to grow some extras to sell on the spur of the moment. I'm not sure why I did that. I don't need the money. Do you know how much it would cost to purchase the canoes and boats? What else do we need? How much would life jackets, paddles, and so on cost? I understand we'd need insurance, an office building, and possibly a small structure or room to sell drinks and house the equipment. Hell, I suppose I could even put in a large cooler for garden supplies. You are sleeping in my garage. No, I cannot have you sleeping in my garage. That would just not be proper. Even if we don't acquire boats and canoes, I could use your assistance around here. I'll work out a fair compensation, and you can sleep in one of the upstairs bedrooms. I will have to purchase a bed for you." But Patricia stepped in and said no. "I appreciate your assistance, but my lodging and board is plenty. I'll help and work alongside you to get food and a place to sleep." But David interrupted her speech and said loudly, "No, Patricia, I will not make you labor for free. That's not correct. I didn't like what Jared did to you, and I'm not going to do it again. We shall choose a reasonable wage, and I will pay it." Patricia glanced at him as if he had grown horns. Then she started on again. She answered, "No, I'll go back to Jared before I let you pay wages for someone to do something you didn't intend to hire anyone for before I came here today." She sat and gazed at David for a moment. Then she proceeded. "Tell me what? I'll do all of the housekeeping, cooking, and so on for the room and board, and you can give me one for the income from the garden and marina for my work. That is my final offer." David sat for a second in disbelief. Then he felt himself start to laugh. He laughed till he sobbed, but he managed to respond. "Okay, you won. I've never had to force someone to accept money before. I suppose I can live with that." Patricia grins and extends her hand. "Shake it, partner," she said. "When can I come out here and start? When you're ready, I suppose. I've already turned the amount of land I plan to plant, but if I'm going to have help, I guess I'll need to plow more up. At least this field beside the river had weeds a few years ago, so I don't have to till sod. We'll discuss about canoes and boats later." Patricia gazed at David. Then she asked, "Can we take your truck, get my stuff, and return a canoe? I don't have much, and I desperately want to get out of his shanty within the next 3 weeks." David learned a few things about Patricia, not the least of which was that she was a far harder worker than he had assumed, and she could cook better than anyone he had ever met. One evening, he asked her how she learned to cook so effectively. Patricia smiled up at him. She explained that my parents managed a good restaurant for many years. I had to help on busy days since I was old enough, even when I wasn't in school. I started out as a bus girl, and then moved on to helping in the kitchen. By the time they sold out, I had memorized nearly all of their recipes. I also tried to work in other food service establishments, but all they wanted to speak about was being a waiter. I attempted it before moving in with Jared, but I couldn't afford to pay rent in a slum hovel while still buying everything else I needed. After they'd planted the seeds and plants, David and Patricia discussed the marina. He chose to buy some second-hand canoes from a company that was going out of business. They also had a fine fishing boat and 2 John boats. He decided that since it was a bundle offer, he couldn't turn down the fishing boat. He and Patricia got work and built a nice facility for the office and small store. He installed a large cooler to store drinks, cold food items, and produce. He expected to harvest later in the year. During their time working together, they formed an easy bond. They were usually smiling and joking about. David would occasionally find Patricia staring at him with a serious expression. He asked her about the situation once or twice, but she blushed and said nothing. During the hottest portion of the afternoon, they would frequently stop working and simply relax. Of course, because he lived on the riverside and there was a lovely gravel bar next to the deep hole, they swam and spent a lot of time in the river, relying on that gravel bar. The river water was warm, and they would carry an inflatable mattress out into the deep water, either lying on it or pushing it between their legs, and sit floating and talking while enjoying one another's company. They spent many delightful hours talking with each other in kayaks full of passing passengers. Finally, David determined that they had created enough infrastructure to try to rent out their boats. He placed an advertisement in the newspaper and had multiple placards printed to play strategically, hoping to whip up business. He even purchased some radio spots. As business increased, Patricia was forced to devote nearly her whole day to the canoe business. Because their produce cooler was in the same facility, she also collected money for the produce that was sold. As the summer proceeded, they discovered that the fishing and ski boats rented faster than the John boats. But the canoes were always full. David was busy tending to the vegetables, gathering and conserving what he believed he'd need for the winter. In late July, they grew so busy that they decided to hire an assistant. Patricia called a friend who was dissatisfied with the canoe rental company she had worked for. They coaxed her into working for them. The new aide allowed them to unwind a little, even go away from the situation together. Until they hired help, they worked 7 days a week for 12 to 14 hours per day. One day, while they were in town, Jared approached them. He was intoxicated, cursing Patricia for leaving. He blamed her for taking all of his business. On the journey back to the farm, David and Patricia discussed Jared's words. She acknowledged she had observed they were renting boats to a lot of folks she recognized from years ago. They had to turn away some business since they didn't have enough canoes. She looked at David and said, "Do you think we could see if Jared wants to sell his canoes? Most of them are old, but in decent condition and might be used in the equipment." "I do not know. I'm not sure if I want to do this type of business. It is getting to where we work, 10 or 12 hours per day, 7 days a week, even with Jody to help. I don't want to work so hard. I admit the money is fantastic, but I don't want to work 60-hour weeks like I did in New York, especially for such a little salary." Patricia looked at David in disbelief, then asked, "What?" "I assumed we were making a lot of money in business. We're currently making more than $2,000 per week gross, which is wonderful. I can't believe you think that's not enough money. How much did you make in New York? I'd rather not talk about it too much, Patricia. But I can say that I made more in a month than we will all season if things continue like they are." Wow. I had always heard about those wealthy Wall Street bankers, but I had no clue they made so much money. Now I see how you fixed up your place. So wonderful. David thought about Patricia's question about buying Jared's business until he fell asleep that night. He awoke thinking about her idea during the night as well. Finally, early the next morning, he woke up and informed her that he was going to town for supplies and coffee. While he was in the cafe, Jared entered. When he spotted David, he began to whine about his taking his customers again. David felt his rage rise. He leaned back in his chair and spoke. "Damn it, Jared. If you treated your customers better, they wouldn't look for another place to rent a canoe. Tell me what? If you're so upset about how bad your business is, why don't you just sell out to me? Wouldn't you like that? A whole. Steal my customers, then steal my canoes. Is this your plan? No. Tell me what? Why don't we send Dale and Chuck over there to inspect your equipment and determine its value? They're in the business and should understand how much it's worth. We'll average the two estimates, and I'll pay you that total for everything. Lock, stock, and barrel." Jared sat at his table, holding his coffee. When Jared thought the cafe owner was not looking, he pulled a bottle from his pocket and poured whiskey into his coffee cup. He sat drinking his drugged coffee. He looked out the window. He glanced at the river, his small shack, and the equipment spread about it. He finally turned to David and muttered, "I guess I'll sell out. Since that little 304 got away, it's been more than Karen and I can handle. I've been trying to get more help, but no one around here wants to work anymore." Jared stood up and nearly staggered out of the cafe, across the street to his store. David looked across at the other two rental owners and said, "Guys, I'd be grateful if you could do this for me. I realize I'm competing with you, but I'm largely taking customers from the little business I bought earlier and a few of Jared's. I suppose I get a few customers that you turn away, but it doesn't cost you anything. Furthermore, if we don't have to apologize for some of his outrageous behavior, we might be able to improve our image." Dale and Chuck exchanged looks for a brief moment. Chuck then said, "Hell, I'm game if you are." He finished his coffee and stood. He proceeded. Let's get her done. They walked directly to Jared's small home and company. He was nowhere to be found. The three evaluated his equipment and had to knock on the door because Jared was still not present. He eventually managed to open the door. Jared could barely stand. The two men gave Jared and David their estimations, and then left. Jared was furious about the amount and argued that he had 3 canoes on the river. Therefore, it should have been more. Jared agreed to sell his entire firm shares to David for around $0, 30 per share, which is equivalent to the cost of new equipment. Before leaving, David took Jared back to the cafe and drafted a sales agreement. They both signed, and David had 2 individuals from the cafe sign as witnesses. Before returning home, David hired a couple of local youths to load and transport the canoes and equipment to his farm as quickly as possible. Patricia smiled as she left the house one day in mid-July. She rushed up to David and shook a letter at him. She said, "Oh, David." John is now able to come home. He says he will be discharged from active service before the end of the month and will return home by early August at the latest. I cannot wait to see him again. Patricia looked upset and said, "Oh, I forgot. He does not have any place to stay. I know he won't want to return to that skank rubbish." David didn't think before speaking. He said, "Help Patricia. You can stay in the other upstairs bedroom for a while if he prefers." "I don't use it, so it's not a huge deal." David stood for a minute before appearing depressed. Patricia glanced at him with concern and asked David what was happening. "Hey, if you don't want John to stay here, that's fine. I'm sure he can find another place to stay." "No, Patricia, that is not it. I was just thinking about that after he found a place to live. So I suppose you'll be leaving me shortly, and I don't want to do it all alone. I'll miss you too." Patricia appeared stunned and stood with her mouth open for a time. Then she remarked, "Oh, I never thought of that. I am sorry, David. I understand you want me out of your house. We will get busy and find a place as soon as possible. Can I still? I mean, do you still want me to help with the work? Or should I start looking for a job?" "No, Patricia, that is not it. I am sure I had good intentions. I'd appreciate it if you maintained assisting with everything. I need to help right now. And, oh heck, David turned and went away, leaving Patricia standing alone. He felt like his heart had been ripped out as he thought of having to live alone again. He and Patricia were nearly strangers for the next 2 days. They chatted very rarely, and when they did not communicate as easily as they had previously. Late one evening, David looked up to see a beat-up old pickup driving down his driveway, trailing dust. He hoped they would not want to rent a canoe. It was too late to go back safely before dusk. The truck came to a stop beside the store, and a well-built, dark-haired young man stepped out. He approached David, and before he could greet him, the man remarked, "I'm John, sprightly. I was told in town that my sister Patricia was out here." David heard Patricia call out, "John!" The store door slammed shut, and Patricia rushed past him, landing in her brother's arms. She hugged and held him close for a time before backing away from him. She took his hand and turned towards David. She said, "John, this is David Dyer. When I was fed up with Jared and your skank, I moved out here with him. He has been allowing me to live with him and help around the house in exchange for my lodging and board. Oh, I'm so delighted you returned. I have a lot to tell you. I don't know where to begin." David noticed John's eyes harden, and he began speaking. David interrupted him and said, "John, I think you have the wrong idea about Patricia and me. When Jared refused to let her stay with him, I allowed her to use my upstairs bedroom. We are now partners in this small business, and she receives a share of the earnings for her efforts. I informed her that you may use the other upstairs bedroom until you found a place to live. I'm going to miss her when you take her away from me. David couldn't go on and turned aside as he walked away. But he continued, I will leave you two alone now. I am sure you have a lot to say to each other, and I do not want to be in the way. Patricia followed David before turning to gaze at John, who was holding her hand. Finally, she pointed to the seats by the river and said, Let's go over there and catch up. I have a few minutes until I have to prepare dinner. Patricia and John had been talking for about 2 hours when they heard David call from the house. He said, Hey, you two. Supper is ready. We can eat when you like. Patricia's eyes grew large, and she appeared nearly terrified. She put her hand to her mouth and murmured, Oops, I forgot the time. And now David has had to undertake some of my work. Come on, John. When they entered the house, Patricia looked at David and said, David, I apologize for letting time get away from me. I will not let this happen again. I, David, gazed at her and John. He saw a flood of rage flash in John's eyes and assumed he knew what he was thinking. David grinned and replied, Hi, girl. I don't own you. It's not a huge deal. I was getting my own meals before you arrived, and I suppose I will after you depart. I understand you had a lot of catching up to accomplish. Forget about it and come eat before the weather turns cold in the coming days. John's attitude started to alter. He realized that the rumors he heard around town, as well as the facts he gleaned from his wife's letters, did not paint a whole picture of Patricia and David's relationship. One day he was outdoors, assisting Patricia with the store, when he noticed David walk by. It wasn't too crowded, so he followed David out into the garden. Hello, David, he said. Could we talk for a minute? David looked up at John and replied, Yes, sure. Let's head over to the chairs. Want a beer? When they were seated and comfortable, John looked at David and began to speak. David, I apologize for not being a good guest. After observing you with Patricia and chatting to her, I realized I had the wrong impression of you. I thought you were a damn city slicker who took advantage, and I am afraid I let my attitude get the best of me. I did not have a bed to sleep in, and despite how I treated you, you allowed me to stay in your home. All I can say is, sorry, and I hope you'll let me make things up to you, David said. Hey, not an issue. I'm sure some of what you were told was done with purpose. In case you hadn't noticed, your wife and her brother don't like me any better than you do. When John wasn't seeking for work, he spent the following few days assisting Patricia and David. By the end of August, he had given up on finding job. The night before, he told his sister and David over the supper table that he expected to have to go to Centerton or Springville to find work. When John took a break by the river the day after he suggested he might depart, David sat near him. He looked across at him and said, John, I'm beginning to believe you won't find a job here, and possibly not any time soon if you try somewhere else. I've been thinking that it's gotten a lot simpler here since you started helping. Next year should be a breeze if you stay. I was wondering whether you wanted to stay on. If you prefer to stay, I'll make you the same bargain I did Patricia. You can live upstairs with her. You can also receive 1/4 of the business's profits. There isn't much profit in the winter, but I could use some help around here. Perhaps you can get part-time work or cut and sell some wood. If you know how to mend things, you might be able to earn money as a handyman. John looked at David. Then he let his sight wander across the landscape. He turned to David and said, I really like it here, and it doesn't cost much for me to live. I was trying to decide whether we should allow some of the people camped down by the river near the swimming hole. I was thinking you might want to put utilities down there and create a proper campground. We could charge them extra for the areas, and I believe if we did that and extended your food crops, we could have a fantastic small. John flushed and continued. I apologize. I mean, you could start a terrific small business. I would be pleased to work for you. I'm having a great time working with the individuals we've brought in over the summer, and I'm happier here with you and Patricia than I've been in years. Furthermore, Patricia's pay is sufficient to cover her living expenses, including accommodation and board. I'm confident I can get by. If I can still stay with you two and share a quarter of the profits. Yes, I would want to stay, if you don't mind. David spent the remainder of the day cultivating his fields after he parked the tractor in the new equipment shed. He strolled towards the river. It had become his habit to take a leisurely swim after work. If no one was nearby, he would just take off his clothing and leap in while wearing only his underwear. If there were still a big number of customers or campers, he would stop by the store and change into swim trunks. Even though it was dusk, he needed to change into trunks. Patricia smiled at David as he entered the store. David waved and entered the restroom to change. Patricia continued speaking with their young clerk. Patricia was out of sight as David emerged from the restroom, carrying his clothing, but she caught up with him before he reached the river. David looked down and realized that she was also wearing a swimsuit. He raised his eyebrows at her without saying anything. Patricia grinned as she stepped closer to David, sliding her arm around his waist. She lay her head against him for a little minute before looking up into his eyes. Patricia pulled aside slightly and spoke. John told me he spoke with you about our idea today. He said you didn't respond to him, David. Have you thought about it? I think it would be an excellent idea. And if we do the majority of the job, it won't cost much extra. Heck, we could even construct shelters, maybe for folks who do not own tents or RVs. Several folks have called to ask if we have utilities and how we might improve the campsites. I've even received a couple calls asking if we rent cabins. Patricia moistened her lips, giving David a troubled look before continuing. I just know we could earn a lot more if we did that. Please. David looked at her and replied, I've been thinking about it since John mentioned it. Patricia, I'm not sure I want to work much harder. We've already worked 14-hour days over the summer. I know we're making good money. I've even considered expanding the store. I've seen that some of the neighbors are buying stuff here. You know, just last month, you talked me into installing a tiny snack bar. And now we're constantly cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You employed girls who are almost completely overloaded. Again, I spotted some of the local farmers stopping by for lunch because their wives work. You are killing me, girl. Patricia smirked as they neared the riverbank. She said, Oh, Pooh, you're having fun flirting with all the women and talking to all the men, and you're aware of it. Besides, the money just keeps coming in, making you even affluent. I believe you just want to complain. Then, with a malicious grin, she shoved David over the bank into the river. David let out a big yell. Then she heard a splash. Patricia's face became white as she gazed over the bank. David was floating face down in the water, motionless. Patricia yelled, David! David, are you okay? He did not move or respond. He just continued floating downstream. She shouted and jumped into the river with David. He had floated downstream from where she had pushed him, and Patricia was able to stand on the river bottom by the time she arrived. She stood up and lifted David's head out of the water. Tears were running down her cheeks as she hugged David to her. Patricia said through her tears, Oh God, what did I do? I have slain him. She drew David to her and hugged him as she began walking quickly toward the shallow water, dragging him along with her. All of a sudden, David surged into action. He stepped up, grabbed Patricia, and threw her back as far as he could into the deeper water. He stated, "I told you that you were killing me. What were you expecting? I nearly died there." Patricia came sputtering to the surface, her face flushed with rage, and she made another beeline for David. He laughed as she moved closer to him. They were in waist-deep water and still had difficulty moving. Patricia charged at David, pounding him with her fists as she yelled out, "I believed I had seriously hurt you. That was not hilarious. Don't do that to me again, honey. I simply couldn't bear the thought of losing you." David gasped and took a step back, attempting to block her strikes. Patricia abruptly stopped beating David and placed her palm over her mouth. "Oh," she said. She gazed at David in despair before splashing from the river and running up the bank. David stayed for a little longer before cautiously walking out of the stream behind her. He watched Patricia go past the store and office complex and toward the house. David gently followed Patricia. He was both shocked and bewildered. He surely couldn't have heard what he thought he heard, could he? It nearly sounded like Patricia called him honey. She seemed to think she loved him or something. He had never done anything to make her believe that. Had he? Hell, there must have been a misunderstanding. That is it. David spent the next few minutes closing the office and store, ensuring that the money was locked in the safe and the books were balanced for the day. He locked the door. He strolled slowly towards his home. He smiled as he walked along, looking down at the river. When he noticed the full campsites and heard the pleasant sounds of campers settling in for the evening. As they continued their field work, they could hear children laughing and playing, as well as the distant sound of one of their neighbors' tractors. Patricia was not present when he arrived at the house. There was no supper ready or being prepared. John had just come downstairs. He looked at David and said, "I believe you stepped into it this time, old son. I haven't seen Patricia this enraged in years. But what? I guess it wasn't particularly funny, but she pushed me into the river and I assumed that playing possum was the thing to do. Has she said anything else? I mean," John just looked at David and said, "Yes, we had a good conversation, but I'm not going there. You two will have to figure this out for yourselves." He busied himself by taking leftover food from the refrigerator and heating it for dinner. Neither man saw Patricia for the rest of the evening. Finally, around 9:30, David said, "I'm exhausted. I guess I'll call it a night." He stood and entered his bedroom. After his shower, he went to bed and fell asleep practically as soon as he put his head on the pillow. Later that night, he heard a commotion and noticed his bedroom door open due to the light coming in from his pole light. He could see a little female figure standing in the doorway. A little voice replied, "Honey, I apologize. I should not have pushed you. I'm just not sure what to do around you. What shall I say? You've been to New York and met all those stunning women, and I'm just an ordinary rural girl, yet I can dream, and I adore you." Patricia entered the room silently and bent down over David's bed. He felt her rest one hand on the bed. She then leaned down and kissed his cheek gently. He didn't realize he'd just reached out and placed his arm around her thighs. He jerked, and she screamed as she landed onto his bed across from him. He slipped his arms around her and pulled her face into his. His lips searched for hers in the near darkness. They made love. He finished by giving her a chaste kiss before rolling off into the bed. David felt Patricia drape an arm and leg over him before resting her head on his shoulder. That was all he knew for the remainder of the night. He awoke with bright sunlight and a heavy weight on his arm. He heard John giggle. Then he said, "Well, it's about time. Should I open up?" Patricia shrieked and jerked in her bed. She grabbed the blankets and attempted to cover her body as she gazed at her smiling brother standing in David's bedroom doorway. Damn you, John! Get out! Get out, now! When David heard the shouts, he awoke with a start and attempted to get up. That was impossible because he was still supervised by Patricia. He stared as John left the room, laughing. John closed the door as he went away, as Patricia instructed. He called through the door, "Take your time." "You too." "I think I can take it for a while longer, but I'm getting hungry, little sis." David looked to Patricia and opened his mouth, but no words came out. He gazed at her and licked his lips before finding his voice. He insisted it wasn't a dream. But was it? "I am sorry." Patricia flushed and shook her head. "No," then leaned in to give David a tender kiss. Stopping him in mid-sentence, she rose up and put on her sleep shirt. She bit her lip and ran out of David's room and up the stairs to her own. David heard the upstairs shower running as he dressed. When a blushing Patricia returned downstairs, David and John were sitting on the porch, drinking coffee and discussing anything but what had happened. Neither knew what to say or how to defeat the 5-ton dragon in the room. David gazed at John, raising his coffee cup and brow. John nodded his head. Yes. David brought both glasses into the kitchen to be refilled. Patricia was busy frying bacon, eggs, potatoes, and onions when David placed the cups by the coffee pot. He moved up behind her and noticed her tits up. She stood motionless as he took the final step up behind her. David drew her closer to his body and leaned down slightly, placing his mouth next to her ear. He whispered, "Patricia, did you mean that?" Patricia trembled once again, and he noticed tears flowing down her cheeks. She bit her lip and nodded her head. Yes. David carefully turned her away from the stove to face him. He peered into her eyes and slowly lowered his face. He gave her a delicate kiss, then pulled back and gazed at her again. He moved back in. This time their kiss was anything but delicate. They were almost about to part ways when John opened the door and asked, "What does a man have to do around here to get a cup of coffee anyway?" David pushed away from Patricia and turned to the coffee pot, pouring 3 cups of coffee. Patricia turned back to the stove. He set her cup beside the stove, handed it to John, and then stepped away, returning to the porch. David paused and turned to face Patricia. He said, "Patricia." When Patricia turned towards him, David continued, "You're wrong, honey. You've got the high-maintenance, selfish City 304 beat hands down. You are so much above them that there is no comparison. It's easy to love someone like you." David saw tears fall down Patricia's cheeks once more. Her body trembled as she cleaned her cheeks with her fingertips. She put out a quiet whine while crying. David returned to take her into his arms once more. He leaned down to give her one more delicate kiss, whispering, "I think I love you too." Patricia looked at his back as he walked out the door. With a sigh, she returned to the stove to cook breakfast, while the 2 men sat on the veranda drinking coffee and watching the world wake up. Her heart was humming, and her stomach fluttered as she thought, fantasized, and cooked. As she worked, she smiled slightly. When the 3 arrived at work that morning, their co-workers noticed something was wrong. Not only were they later than usual, but David and Patricia appeared to be more attentive to one another and aware of where the other was. John only smirked at them, satisfied. A number of the women who knew Patricia's feelings regarding David exchanged puzzled looks and raised their eyebrows. Patricia and David gradually became more attentive to each other over the next few days. When they walked past one another, they were more likely to touch and smile. It became normal for them to take breaks together and spend time alone in or near the river at the end of the day. Finally, one day, while floating in the river on air mattresses, David glanced at Patricia and asked, "Patricia, would you join me for a show and supper on Friday?" Patricia felt her heart lurch. When she stared at David, her expression became blank, and she reddened slightly. "Yes," she said. "I'd love to go any place with you." Finally, Friday arrived, and Patricia was perplexed. She simply had pants, shorts, t-shirts, and a few blouses. In short, she just owned work clothing. She never imagined she'd need better clothes until they went to a fast food restaurant. She felt she couldn't dress adequately. She needed to do something. But what? Finally, after breakfast, she reached out and grabbed David's arm as they began their business. "David, please. I need to speak with you for a minute. I need to know, David. You are aware that I do not have any appropriate attire for a fine dining establishment. All I own are the clothing I wear to work around here, and the majority of them are worn out. I know you've taken me to Walmart when I needed to buy anything for myself, but I never considered the necessity for fancier items. I do not want to embarrass you if we go anywhere. Can we just ignore this? Perhaps simply go to McDonald's or somewhere tonight? I'll get a good dress the next time I visit Walmart, if you would like to go somewhere with me again." "No, Patricia. I want to go out for a lovely supper with you. I didn't consider about clothing. I apologize. We'll leave a little early, and perhaps we'll be able to handle that. But I plan to take you out for a lovely lunch," David informed John and the help. John was in charge that afternoon because he and Patricia had business to conduct in town. David instructed Patricia to be ready to leave by 3 p.m., as they needed to stop by some stores for supplies before eating. Patricia was concerned about the trip. She put on her best pants and top, but she still felt dowdy, especially when David emerged from his room wearing a good suit. She blushed and turned to flee back to her room, saying, "Oh, I can't go with you when I look so trashy and you look so handsome." David grabbed her arm and drew her toward the door as he screamed, "No! Patricia, we're going. That concludes things." Patricia sat on her side of his pickup, staring out the window all the way to town. She was hurting inside. She felt so ordinary, so ashamed of her appearance. David was really gorgeous, and his outfit must have cost several $100s. She had seen the tag on it one day when hanging up his washing, and it read Armani. She had no idea how much the garments from there cost, but she knew they were both expensive and of great quality. David drove to the mall and stopped as close to the expensive women's stores as possible. He walked around the truck, then opened Patricia's door. He dragged her out of the truck and forced her to walk into the first store with him. She resisted and proceeded hesitantly. Tears were visible in the corners of her eyes. They walked into one store, stopping once or twice to look at outfits, but David continued on. In the second store, David came to a halt in front of a stunning dress rack. One of the younger clerks approached them. She looked at Patricia and sneered. She turned to David and offered him a 1,000-watt smile as she gushed. "Good afternoon, sir. Could I assist you?" "I hope so. My acquaintance here has wardrobe issues. She's lost her suitcase, and we have a crucial dinner meeting in less than 2 hours. We need to find a nice cocktail dress and all of the accessories in less than 90 minutes. Do you believe you can help us with this?" The young lady glanced at him with a predatory expression. Then he cast another peek at Patricia. Her disdainful expression returned when she stared at Patricia. She turned to David and said, "Well, I am sure we can come up with something." But David had noticed the glance, the change in expression, and recognized it for what it was. He'd seen that expression many times in New York. Another high-maintenance 304 with delusions of superiority confronted them. The main difference was that she was probably not as wealthy as those other women, and she wasn't as good at carrying off the attitude. David took Patricia's hand and spoke loudly. "Forget it. Now that I think about it, I realize you can't assist us. We will just go somewhere else." David and Patricia began to move away toward the exit. The sales clerk stared at them, stunned. As they approached the entrance, an older, well-dressed lady stopped them. She extended her hand toward them and asked, "Excuse me, sir, is there a problem? I overheard a portion of your chat, and if there is an issue, I want to put it right. I'm the major here, and if there is anything I can do to assist, I would be honored." David paused for a time, looking her in the eyes before relaxing slightly. "I am not sure. As I informed your clerk, we have a wardrobe issue and have less than 90 minutes to resolve it. We need a great evening dress and accessories for an important meeting. I was interested in one of the outfits on the rack we were standing near. However, I believe we may be able to go on. I dislike your clerk's attitude, and I refuse to put up with it. With her attitude, I assumed we'd never find what we needed here. So we're leaving. Please, sir, let me try to assist you. I think I have just the item for your girlfriend." The manager led David and Patricia back to the rack where the clerk was standing. She glared at David. When her manager mentioned anything, she blushed considerably. "Charlotte, I need you to move forward. Keep an eye out in front of me as I attend to these customers. See if you can get through the evening without running off any more clients." The manager began pulling dresses off the rack and holding them up to Patricia. Some she would set aside, while others returned immediately. They finally got 3 to try on. She turned to Patricia and said, "Come on, my dear. We need to rush if we want to meet your deadline." Patricia turned to David and murmured, "David, I cannot afford any of those dresses. The lowest one costs almost $500. That's nearly as much as I have in my bank account. Please, can we go somewhere else?" "No, Patricia. We have supper reservations and we'll be going. I'm going to pay for the outfit, and you are going to accept it. Now move forward. David, please. I cannot allow you do it. Just take me to Sears, Target, or even Walmart. I'm sure I can find something that will work." "No, Patricia, I do not want something that will suffice. I want something that will highlight your true beauty, and this will make you feel like the amazing woman you are. Now move forward. Please." He turned around and gently pushed her toward the woman waiting in front of the changing room. Patricia approached her with a horrible smirk on her face. Twice. She looked back to David. The first 2 outfits fit her well, but the third did not. Oh, how she shined in it. It was a deep electric blue with a long skirt that ended at mid-thigh. It had a plunging neckline and an exposed back that almost reached her waist. The color accentuated Patricia's eyes and made her hair sparkle. She exuded sass while also being stately and sophisticated. Patricia froze in surprise when she saw David's face. His mouth dropped open and he simply stared. He twirled his finger. When Patricia finished the circle, David smiled widely. David looked at the manager and replied, "We'll take it now. All we need are shoes, a handbag, and stockings." He looked at Patricia and stated in a softer tone, "And maybe some other things if Patricia wants." After 30 minutes, they were going out of the store. David was carrying a bag containing Patricia's old clothes while she wore her new dress. Her clothing suited David's suit nicely. All eyes were on them as they walked through the mall and out to his truck. David assisted Patricia in her door, then quickly walked to his side and entered the truck. After closing his door, he turned and glanced at Patricia. Patricia glanced at him with concern and questioned, "What? You are just stunning. That dress is really wonderful for you. I'm really amazed and proud. You join me tonight." Patricia felt tears well up in the corners of her eyes again and whacked David on the arm. "Oh, hush. You see, I'm just a plain old country girl putting on airs. You know who and what I am, and it is neither lovely nor elegant." Patricia smiled and continued, "But thank you nonetheless. Now let's go. I am starving, and you promised me supper." David pulled up to his favorite French restaurant and shut off the engine after parking. Patricia was once again looking terrified. She looked at David and whispered, "Oh, David, not here. I've heard that one dinner here costs the same as a week's worth of food at home." David forced her once more to accompany him into the restaurant. The maitre d' smiled and welcomed David. "Mr. Dyer, very great to see you again. This time I'm accompanied by a lovely lady. Please, go this way." Patricia glanced at David in surprise as the maitre d' addressed him by name. She let David lay his hand in the small of her back and gently guided her to their table. Patricia looked up at the maitre d' as he drew out her chair and seated her. She felt quite special when he laid her napkin in her lap. Patricia took far too long to decide on her lunch. She was horrified at the pricing. Finally, she let David convince her that he didn't care what she ordered or how much it cost. Patricia ordered chicken ambassador and David got beef medallions. Their beverages arrived almost immediately after they ordered, followed by their appetizers. David and Patricia finished their appetizers and spoke briefly before their salad arrived. The salad was delicious, just like the appetizer. Then came a little cup of soup. Again, it was fantastic. Patricia moaned with ecstasy as she took the first bite of her meal. She glanced at David and remarked, "Oh, David, this is the best meal I've had since I was a girl. The ambassador is excellent. Thank you very much for suggesting I accompany you this evening. I believe I could die happily right now." Patricia was sipping her after-dinner port and enjoying her dessert following their delicious meal. David looked at her and said, "Patricia, I know I promised you we could go see a movie. I don't want to do it right now. Are you offended if we went dancing instead? However, if you truly want to attend the performance, we can." Patricia felt terror tighten her gut as David begged if they could skip the movie. She was certain she had embarrassed him, and he wanted to get her home as soon as possible so he could forget what had transpired that evening. She had learned how to behave in polite environments while working with her parents, but she no longer felt at ease in them. When she heard David ask if they might go dancing instead going to the play, she smiled brighter than he'd ever seen. She replied, "Yes, I'm not a very good dancer, but I'd love to dance with you, David." Of course, Patricia anticipated David to take her to a club with a modest dance floor. Instead, he took her to one of the city's most expensive nightclubs. She was so used to his choices for the evening that she didn't make another scene. She remained reluctant to enter. However, neither of them were particularly skilled dancers. But they danced and had fun. Patricia's eyes gleamed and she smiled often. After a few minutes, many males approached her, one by one, and requested her to dance. After she got over her amazement at their question, she became quite firm. None of the men who approached her got to dance with her. If she and David did not dance, she eventually sat out around 1 p.m. David said to Patricia, "I need to use the restroom." "Then I suppose we should call it a night, if that is okay." Patricia grinned and replied, "Fine. I'll be right here. I don't have to go again, so I'll wait for you." There was a waiting to enter the facilities. It took David over 15 minutes to get back to Patricia. When he returned, he discovered a huge, flat-dressed young man attempting to get Patricia to dance with him. She said no twice. When David arrived, he noticed the man reaching for her arm and pulling her to the ground. David overheard him say, "Come on, honey. I know you're new here and don't know me, but nobody refuses to dance with me. I am Jared Richmond." He grinned at her. David stepped up and said, "Hi, buddy." The lady stated that she did not want to dance. "Now, why don't you return to your table before there is trouble?" The young man snarled at David, but it came out as a whole. "This lady and I do not need you interfering with our business. She is going to dance with me for a bit. We'll see whether she still wants to be with a loser like you." Patricia glanced at David with relief and said, "Oh, David, I was starting to wonder where you were. Can we please get out of here now?" The man gripped Patricia's arm and glanced at her. Then David responded, "You can't get out of here. I own this club, and I plan to dance with you. You'll go after. We're done." The man raised his hand above his head, snapping his fingers. A bouncer stared at him and began approaching the three. Once more, the man turned to David. He said, "I told you to get lost, asshole. Move on before you get into more than you can manage." Patricia gazed at David before turning to the man holding her. Her foot flashed and hit, and her attacker doubled over, wailing in anguish. His hands moved to the cup, nearly crushing the nuts. Patricia whirled on her heel and her elevated foot hit his face. The force of the kick caused his head to bounce back, and he crashed onto the floor, toppling a table as he did so. Two very large bouncers had arrived and apprehended David and Patricia. David and Patricia were detained until the ambulance and police came. They were hauled to the station and interrogated. They were finally released at 6 a.m. The police had obtained testimonies from witnesses to the conflict and decided to release Patricia pending the prosecuting attorney's decision. Mr. Richmond had planned to seek charges for assault, but the preponderance of evidence showed he was the aggressor. Therefore, Patricia and David were freed after interrogation. When they got home, the workers had already started the day's work. Everyone who saw David's truck stopped and stared as he and Patricia got out of it. They'd never seen either of them dressed up, especially in what appeared to be really expensive clothing. Patricia collapsed into David's arms, crying profusely as soon as they entered the house. She burst into tears. "Oh, David, I am so sad. We had such a great day. Then I ruined it. I can understand if you never want to go out with me again." She laid her head on his chest, her hand alongside it, as she felt him bring her close. David stated, "Shush. I had a terrific time until you had to deal with that idiot. I was ready to punch him out when you brought him down." "That was great. I hope you never become furious with me. Now, don't worry about it. I'm going to make him regret ever screwing with us." Patricia looked up in astonishment as David gently guided her into his bedroom. They fell asleep practically as soon as they had covered themselves. When the two lovers failed to show up at the office, John went in search of them. He grinned as he observed them sleeping together before returning to work. Later that morning, John and the help had time to examine the papers left by their clients and came upon the news piece regarding David and Patricia's arrest. They were shocked and eager to hear the news straight from the source. Approximately 2 p.m., the two walked meekly inside the office, where they spent the next 30 minutes answering questions and explaining about their evening. Later that day, Patricia overheard David on the phone. She wasn't sure who he was talking to, but she heard him say, "I don't care. I want to make that asshole suffer. I want him to be wounded, and I want it quickly so you can file any lawsuits you need to for me and Miss Sprightly. What he did is ridiculous. You know, if he did that to us, he has most likely done it to others. Find out if there are more women. He's done this to get them involved. If there is. And you can persuade them to join our case. I want him crucified." Patricia was appalled. She'd never seen David from that perspective before. When he spoke with the attorney on the phone, he appeared to be a completely different person. His eyes were steely, and his face was covered in a mask that she never wanted to see again. As she turned to leave the office, she noticed John standing behind her. John grinned and added, Come on, Patricia. It sounds like David has things under control. I wouldn't want to be in Richmond's position, especially since David is so upset at him. When that man's balls are in an uproar, he goes for the jugular. I've seen that face before in combat, and it always ends badly for the opposition. Patricia shook as she looked up at John's face and saw David's expression reflected there. Her men were there to defend her. Certainly, she thought. When David exited the office, he went directly to the cooler and pulled out a Bush tall boy. He did not say anything as he walked out of the store and down to the river. His face still reflected the stress and determination John and Patricia had witnessed when he was on the phone. They stared at each other and began to follow him out of the store. Patricia stepped out the door, looking at the two clerks and saying, "You two need to handle things for a while. I'm not sure when we'll get back." By the time the two siblings caught up with David, he was standing on the riverside, watching the stream pass. He clearly did not see his surroundings. He had that expression. Only a few people identify the look of eagles as they contemplate their prey. David drank the rest of his beer, crushed the can, and dumped it into a container. Patricia stepped up to him and placed her arm around his waist without hesitation. David wrapped her in his arm. She rested her head on him as they stood staring out over the river. Neither spoke a thing. It was a moment when words were neither necessary nor desired. John stayed a few feet behind them for a bit before turning and walking back into the store without saying anything. He got 2 more beers and a Pepsi for Patricia before returning. By the time he arrived at the river, David and Patricia had gone down the gravel bar and were standing in water up to their necks. David leaned down and gave Patricia a gentle kiss. He pulled back, and they peered into one another's eyes for a moment before kissing again. When David saw John, he was deciding whether to say something or leave. Patricia followed David's lead as he jolted and turned his head toward the bank. They pulled apart. They turned to gaze at John, who grinned and lifted the drinks to them. David and Patricia left the stream hand in hand. The 3 buddies sat on chairs beneath a giant beer-drinking tree watching the river pass by. Patricia had pulled her chair as close to David's as she could, and occasionally one of them would reach out and softly touch the other. One of the 3 would periodically make a comment, usually about their business or someone they knew, but there were many moments of quite companionable stillness. Finally, David turned to face the other 2. He began speaking seriously with frequent pauses, as if what he was saying was painful. In fact, it was clear that he was discussing traumatic moments. When I returned home, I almost despised the world. I had every intention of building a shack here and living as a hermit. I did not want to see or speak to anyone. All I wanted was to spend my life in comfort. I had lost both my parents and grandparents in the years leading up to my return home. I experienced 2 bad breakups with semi-serious relationships. My fiancée left me 6 weeks before the wedding. We were having problems because she wanted to party and spend everything we earned and more. I wanted to enjoy life, save money, and spend time at home with friends. I had almost decided to end our relationship, but I wanted to give it another shot. We went to Miami for a week, and I want to reconnect. She abandoned me in the middle of our first night, leaving no message. I was worried she had been harmed or kidnapped for that week and the majority of the next 2 before I saw her leave her office with another man. I discovered she had done similar things to other lovers. It nearly killed me, so I decided to sell everything and return home. I was fed up with the city. It has gaps, as does my job. When I returned, I spent several weeks cleaning up and working on my home. I had planned to buy a canoe or john boat to use on the river. I decided to rent a canoe and take the day off because I hadn't done it before. I had to go to Jared because no other places had any left. David looked up at Patricia and continued. I met Patricia for the first time that day. Well, not really. I'd seen her driving down the road and around town, but only from a distance. I was upset while watching her work that day. Jared just sat on his fat buttocks, drinking beer, while she loaded my canoe and so on. Karen was sitting with him, fixing her nails. I recall sitting in the truck cab and Patricia trying to get me to talk. David grinned and glanced at the two again before continuing. I was almost angry enough with her to tell her to shut up. All I wanted was peace and quiet, just as I remembered the float to be. I ignored her, looking out the window and only responding when I felt compelled to. I was about to unload on her when I caught myself. I remember thinking, "You asshole! You're about to crap on the poor girl while she's merely doing her job." You observed she received no assistance from the other two bastards at the rental agency. She's simply trying to be friendly. I recall moving my head to look at Patricia and seeing pain in her eyes. I suppose she could see I was angry at her, and I felt like a jerk. I felt like a few of the assholes. I had left New York to get away. Those who would snarl and hurl their weight around at those they considered inferiors. I believe it was the day Patricia began to heal me. We didn't communicate that day, but I felt like it was a great triumph just to prevent from snapping her head off. I pushed out into the river as fast as I could. And when I was out of sight, I just lay back and drifted with the current. It was so calm, so serene. I could hear the insects and small animals rustling in the foliage along the bank. From time to time, a fish would jump and birds would flit around and sing. I mostly hurried through the sunlit areas, although I lingered in the shade. I felt the rage and tension leave me and run downstream. A few days later, while working one morning, I remembered Patricia. I'm not sure why, but I just put my tools away and headed back for another canoe ride. David grinned and looked back at his two pals before continuing. That time, I got into the truck with Patricia and spoke to her. I can't recall what we talked about, but it wasn't like speaking with a woman in New York. It felt more genuine. I felt accepted. For whom? For what I was, the talk was relaxed and delightful. There was no tension, no searching for deeper meaning, no attempting to demonstrate how essential one or the other of us was. I didn't get the idea I was being interviewed to determine whether I was wealthy enough or had a decent enough career to pursue. The conversation was exactly what it was. A visit from two kind people who were enjoying the day and the travel. I felt the bindings around my heart and spirit loosen even more. Every time I went on a canoe excursion, I felt myself relax and rediscover my own identity. I began to look forward to my canoe outings, and I ended up taking more than I had planned, and then I should. And it was largely because I enjoyed speaking with you, Patricia. Then when you arrived and asked if you might labor here for room and board, I nearly blew it. I knew you had a difficult task ahead of you, but you caught me off guard, and my thoughts returned to New York. I remembered Kathy and the way she treated me. She and my other two lovers had also begged to move in with me and offered to help with the expenditures that they had imposed on me. You had almost left before I could pull my thoughts away from those 300 hours. And remember that you were not like them. I had seen you labor your buttocks off for scraps, and I knew you wouldn't shit on me like they had. I knew you weren't giving up your body to me. That is exactly what they had done. They assumed that if they slept with me a couple times a month, I would be happy to pay for everything. Neither of them volunteered to pay for anything, and you almost didn't move in because you believed I didn't have to compensate you for your efforts. I believe it is when I began to fall in love with you, Patricia. Patricia gasped and looked over to David as he stated he loved her. She levitated out of her chair and sprang into David's lap. She placed her arms around him, hugged as tightly as she could, and kissed him. He softly pulled her back and continued, looking into her eyes. Since then, I've been watching you and spending time with you every day, and I'm falling more and more in love with you. David looked over at John, who was staring at the two with a shocked expression and his mouth slightly open. David looked into Patricia's eyes once more and continued. Patricia, I know I'm damaged goods, and I'm far from flawless, but I realized last night when I noticed that a hole was disturbing you, that I loved you very much. Patricia, will you marry me? Patricia was crying as she drew David's face into hers and kissed him. She cried in between sobs and kisses. Yes. Oh, yes. David. Oh, God, I love you too. And I never in my life imagined you would ask me to marry you. John had risen from his chair and stood beside David and Patricia. His hand was extended and he said, Congratulations, you two. David, when I first came out here, I already knew you were an a-hole who was taking advantage of my sister. I was ready to kick your buttocks and barely held back from just hammering you. When we began talking, I was embarrassed when within minutes you had invited me to reside in your home. Then I felt much more humiliated when I got to speak with Patricia and learned about your bargain with her. She even informed me that you refused to go upstairs when she moved in. You told her it was her haven and you didn't belong there. Then I watched you two dance around each other for over a year. Even a blind man could see you were in love. I believe I was as delighted as you were when I saw you in bed a few weeks ago. I understand you don't need it, but David, you have my approval to marry Patricia. And I want you to know that she could not have done better, in my opinion. David looked at John and replied, Thank you. He removed his right arm from around Patricia and reached for his pocket. He rummaged around for a bit, a worried expression on his face. He finally discovered what he was looking for and relaxed. He pulled his hand from his pocket, opened it, and showed Patricia an engagement ring. Patricia, I can go get you a new ring if you want, but I truly want you to keep this one. It was my mother's ring, and wearing it would be very meaningful to me. When I became engaged to Kathy, my parents were still living, so she could have gotten this ring and soiled it with her deceit. On second thought, she probably wouldn't have worn it because it wasn't showy enough and was simply an old ring. I like to assume that this ring contains the love and soul of my parents' marriage. I've rarely encountered a couple who I believed were more in love than my parents, and I hope we can have the same kind of relationship. Patricia smiled and cautiously extended her left hand so David could slide the ring onto her finger. She smiled and added, Yes, David, I would be proud to wear your mother's ring. I can't fathom finding a nicer ring than this. We could locate something more spectacular, larger, and shinier, but it would never mean as much to me as this one. The three companions were walking back to the store when they noticed a beautiful new Cadillac racing down the driveway, trailing a massive, billowing dust cloud. The automobile came to a stop near them. The driver sat inside while the dust cloud blew past the automobile, engulfing the three in its gritty obscurity. After the dust had settled, a huge man with silver hair emerged from the driver's door, and a slightly younger man from the passenger seat. They both looked around with scorn, then approached the three people standing there. The driver looked them over before asking, Do you work here? David began to speak, but John beat him to it. He said, Yes, sir. I work here. What can I do for you? The man turned to face him and continued speaking. He said, I am looking for a David Dyer. Where is his office? Before John or Patricia could speak, David stepped forward and introduced himself as David Dyer. How can I help you? The man stared at David and nearly sneered in disgust. He moved his glance up and down David's body, noting the wet, raggedy shorts and shirt, muddy shoes, and unkempt appearance. David could see the attitude developing in his head. Finally, he said, "You may drop your lawsuit against my establishment and my son. I'm not sure how you can justify pursuing a harassment claim against my son because he asked some little crumpet to dance. But I'm here to warn you that if you don't abandon your attempt at legal extortion, you'll be in a world of hurt. I'll pound you into the ground and you'll blow away like this. Damn dust." The passenger turned to the driver and said, "Buddy, I need you to remember what we discussed. I'm your attorney, and we need to keep things professional." Patricia opened her lips to say something when David snapped, "Patricia! That is enough." David turned and headed into the office, picking up his cell phone. He came out the door and stopped to take a picture of the vehicle, making sure to include the license plate. He approached the four standing, glaring at each other, and took a picture of the enraged man and his purported attorney. After taking the images, David dialed his phone and started conversing. He said, "Solange, this is David Dyer. Let me speak with Steve, please. I have a situation that we need to deal with right now." "Oh, crap. Okay. Can I call him there? Or does he have his phone with him? Okay. I will try it." David looked up, astonished by the look of nearly terror mixed with reverence. He looked into the attorney's eyes. He answered, "Steve is at the Taylor's. You're aware that they have poor cell service there, but if I can catch him, he's only a few kilometers away." David dialed and started talking almost immediately. "Hey, Jimbo, how are things going?" "Yeah. Say, I hate to butt in, but I have a minor issue over here. Solange said Steve was over there, and I need his expert advice as quickly as possible." "Okay. Thank you." After a little period of stillness, David resumed his conversation. He described what had happened and the interaction with the men. Then he answered, "Okay. Yeah. We're at the office." "Great. See you then. Steve is on his way there. Why don't we all go over to the shade and take a seat while we wait for him?" About 5 minutes later, another gorgeous Cadillac drew up next to the one there. This time, however, there was very little dust. Attending with another gorgeous silver-haired man, he came up and joined the gathering at the picnic table. David stood. Then the rest of them rose up. David grinned and shook hands as he spoke. "I'm glad you could make it here, Steve. Sorry to interrupt Jim and his crew's conversation, but this gentleman wants us to dismiss the lawsuit against that Richmond jackass. I thought you'd like to participate in that discussion." When David referred to the man who had bothered Patricia as an asshole, his father's face became more red and angry. The attorney's face stiffened, and he appeared nearly afraid. Before anyone could say anything else, Steve Dawson started speaking. He said, "Okay, David, I am here now. And while this little visit is not acceptable, perhaps we can reach an understanding." Steve turned to face the attorney and proceeded. "Martin, I'm amazed you'd act like this. I was convinced you had more ethics than this demonstrated." It doesn't matter. Let's get started." Steve took his seat and faced Mr. Richmond and his counsel. He resumed speaking. "So, what's this about dismissing our lawsuits? And what exactly are you promising us if we do this? I know Mr. Dyer is indignant and ashamed about the treatment he received, but he is also troubled and concerned about it. Miss Patricia sprightly had to endure both in your establishment and at the police station. As you are aware, they are quite passionate about their jobs and expect to be satisfied. In fact, Patricia's brother John was so unhappy that when Steve uttered his name, Mr. Richmond swung his head around and stared at him. Then he looked at Patricia. He flushed and appeared to sink into his seat. He said, "Patricia and John," sprightly. "Oh, shit. Were you the offspring of Thomas and Linda? Is it all about the stock they have at my club?" John was astonished, then looked at Steve before responding, "Yes, they were our parents." "What is it to you? What are you talking about stock anyway?" Mr. Richmond spoke. "Crap. This is only getting worse." He went to his lawyer and continued. "Thomas and Linda died. These two own a third of the club. I offered their parents third ownership because they loaned me the money to open it. For years, I've been attempting to save up enough money to buy them out. But given our expenses and Darlene's spending habits, I haven't been able to. Crap. How are we going to clean up this mess? They will not only sue themselves in this action, but if they win or drag it out, we may lose business." Richmond returned to the Sprite lease and said, "Well, if this is about money, you can just forget it." "I haven't got it yet. I've only barely been able to pay salaries. So you have nothing coming to you. Now can we just get this whole mess over with?" Patricia looked astonished, and John glared at the man as he spoke. He asked, "You mean your club is Essendon Enterprises, which we own stock in?" "I discovered that certificate right before going to Iraq, but when I inquired about it, none of the stockbrokers I spoke with knew anything about it. I had planned to find out more after I returned, but I've been too busy around here." Richmond looked down and said, "Screw my big mouth." Then he looked up at them before continuing. "Yes, I worked for your parents in the restaurant, but I wanted to enlarge the bar and include a nightclub. They merely wanted a quiet little bar within the eatery. I planned to leave and go out on my own, but I couldn't afford it. I'm not sure why, but one day your father offered to help me. And we rented the building next to the restaurant so that I could open the club. Of course, when your parents died and the restaurant was sold, I lost my favorable rent and had to relocate. That nearly led me to close. But we hung on. And now, we're doing fine. This case will have serious consequences. Even if you don't win, the exposure will turn many people away. And if you win, I may have to shut down. You'll have to forget about receiving any money from me." Mr. Richmond looked at Patricia and questioned, "Did my son actually say what you allege in your lawsuit? Did he really try to drag you onto the floor after you said you didn't want to dance? You know, he and the bouncers both claim you agreed to go with him until Mr. Dyer returned to your table. Wasn't the whole affair just a setup?" Patricia began talking. She nodded and replied, "Yes. He tried to force me, and he wasn't very kind about it. He bruised my arm. He gripped me so strongly." David stood up and said, "You know, the police have statements from some of the people sitting at tables around us. I think he did exactly what we say he did. As a businessman, you must be aware that if he did this to Patricia and continues to do it to other girls, you will eventually lose business. Nobody wants to go out where they or their dates will be treated this way." Mr. Richmond groaned and replied, "I know We had some issues with him in college, but he doesn't do that now. In fact, I believe the women who accused him of pestering them were simply seeking to delve into our pockets, just like you are. We are better off and more noticeable than his peers and money. Grubbers are constantly popping out of the woodwork, hoping to get a piece of our change." Mr. Richmond's attorney snapped his head around and laid his hand on his client's arm. He said, "Richard, you should watch it. You promised to let me bargain." Steve was sitting at the table and smiling. He stated, "I need to discuss this with my clients. Please pardon us for a moment." The three buddies and their attorney got up from the table and strolled around the premises. They stood in the shade, discussing the afternoon's developments. Steve stated that if you two own a third of the establishment, Mr. Richmond is correct. You may be chopping off your nose to spite your face by filing this case. I'm not sure how much the club is worth or how much your parents provided him, but if they had to close due to this, you may lose your stake in the club. Of course, if they have a strong insurance coverage and we want a hefty payoff, it may not be a bad thing. However, based on what you told me and what the witnesses say, I don't see you getting more than a minimal sum. If the exposure hurts the club, you may wind up losing more than you gain. He groaned and asked, So, what do you want to do? Should we attempt to negotiate a settlement? Should we drop the lawsuits? Patricia and John exchanged glances before turning their attention to David. John stated that since it was your decision, the a-hole was playing with you. Hell, we haven't gotten $1 from them in the 3 years since Dad and Mom died. So, even if we push them to bankruptcy, what have we lost? You do anything you think you want to do. Patricia approached David and wrapped her arm around him. She looked up at him and said, David, honey, what do you think? I'm no expert, and I'd need to see the books to pass judgment, but I believe this is a lot of nonsense. A club like that in New York, as popular as it is, would be a gold mine. I believe he opted not to pay you because you were not hounding him for your cut of the earnings. He is either skimming, keeping a lot of money in the club's books, or paying out far too much in salaries to someone. I'm betting that someone or those people are him and or his family. I recommend that we demand to see the books. First off, I believe I believe you should inform him that you want your CPA to review the books to discover why you haven't been receiving your half of the take and what your next course of action will be regarding the lawsuit. Even if you decide to dismiss the lawsuit against the company, you may still have one against the kid with whose name, oh yes, Jared. David turned to Steve and asked, What are your thoughts, Steve? However, releasing the club from the litigation may undermine our case. However, I believe it is prudent to review the books and obtain an analysis of the business. David stared into space. Finally, he went to John and asked, John, do you have any of those papers that you can access quickly? Well, I have a box of Fox business documents upstairs. I am not sure what's in these. When they died, we cleaned up their house and office, and I boxed up their belongings. We had to sell virtually everything to cover their costs. They did not have sufficient insurance to cover their medical expenses following the accident, and practically everything they had went into it. Then I made a mistake and transferred the few $1,000s remaining to Patricia and my joint account. I never considered using my power of attorney to allow Karen to clean it out while I was in Iraq. Well, as you know, we now have nothing, unless by chance something turns out to be useful. John, why don't we go see what we can find right now? David turned to Steve and continued. Can you and Patricia keep them busy till we return? See if you can get them to make an offer. Perhaps the four set off on their different errands. After roughly 30 minutes, David smiled. He had discovered the stock certificate and a note from Mr. Richmond thanking the stockholders for their trust in him. It referred to the attached stock certificate for 1/3 of the shares of S&E Enterprises and acted as a receipt for the $40,000 paid for the stock. The certificate was for 400 shares, with a par value of $100. They now knew how much money John and Patricia could lose if the firm failed. David sat back and gazed at John. Then he added, John, without seeing the books, check the cash flow and profits. I cannot make a final decision, but if they own the building. Wait a minute. Let me check something. David grabbed his phone and phone book. He pulled up a phone number and dialed. This is David Dyer. I'm an investment banker, and we're talking with S and in businesses. who claimed to own the building at 1724 Industrial Avenue in Springville. Could you please verify that and notify me of any outstanding liens? Yes, I'll hold, if I can. A few minutes later, David began to smile and added, Yes. I understand. Thanks. David turned back to John and explained that while they own the building, there is a $117 million loan on it. The property is evaluated at $750,000 for tax reasons. With the current real estate market, I'm willing to wager they owe more on the building than it would sell for if we forced the sale. The two buddies strolled back to the office, motioning for Steve and Patricia to join them. He told them what he found out over the phone and showed them the documentation he discovered in the box. He started talking to the three people standing next to him. I used to work in the investing industry and believe I have a decent working knowledge of money. Having said that, and admitting that I worked on the bond desk, I have some ideas about this situation. Your parents gave Richmond $40,000, and if I understand correctly, there has been no refund to you or your family. I still believe he is using your money and has no intention of paying you any earnings from the business. I propose that we threaten to proceed with the lawsuits or give him the option to rein in his son. Drop the countersuits, and we'll buy you out of the business. I'm not sure whether you can come up with any money, but I have my suspicions. The four returned to the table and took their seats. David looked at the other three and started speaking. My clients and I have prepared an offer for you, Mr. Richmond. We found some documentation on the funds you acquired from their parents. If I understand correctly, you received $40,000 from their parents over 15 years ago and have never made any distributions to them for their portion of the earnings. We need to see the business books and tax filings from those years to determine whether this is appropriate. In addition, we would want to see the minutes of the Board of Directors meeting that discussed officer and director remuneration. We also want to examine a breakdown of employee compensation to see whether it is appropriate. It has been my experience that a business like yours has incredibly good cash flow and creates big profits when run appropriately. I've been in your restaurant several times, and it's always really busy. My clients and I thus propose that you grant them a cash buyout right now for $200,000, with a breakdown of $125,000 to Patricia, of which $50,000 would be set aside for compensation. Due to your son's behavior, the remaining $75,000 would be given to John as his portion of the initial loan's missed profits. If you do not agree to this now, we will get your books. Each year, they file tax returns and claim their due part of the profits. Richmond got to his feet and started spluttering. His face was pasty white, and he began backing up toward his car. What? How dare you? What rights do you have to demand my books and records? We're here to get you to dismiss this annoying lawsuit. Not to discuss my business. I should mention that this is a business. It is none of your concern. Richmond's lawyer looked stunned at David. He then developed a ghastly grimace on his face. He turned to Mr. Richmond and stated, I told you I didn't want you talking. I had no idea. If these individuals hold a major amount of your company, they have the right to see the books. You have an LLC, right? You were required to see that they received a Schedule K-1 each year demonstrating their business income. They had to report on their tax returns. Didn't you email them the reports? Richmond appeared whiter and stuttered unintelligibly. His attorney looked over at Steve and said, Steve, I'm not sure what to tell you. I believe my client and I should return to my office to investigate this further. Please pardon us. After the two go, everyone remained seated, staring into the distance. Finally, Steve gave a slight grin and remarked, I believe we have. No. I believe Mr. Richmond has a significant problem on his hands. Are you certain you never received a K-1 or distribution from S.N.? The two siblings shook their heads no more. Steve looked around the room and remarked, Well, I believe I've done everything I can here today. First thing tomorrow morning, I'll send an official letter requiring that the books pass tax returns and other business paperwork. If they do not reveal the documents freely, I will seek a court order for their release. I'll also need to know what you expect out of this disaster. But what happens if he does not pay the $200,000 we negotiated today? Give it some thought. If he did not provide you with the documentation as required, it is likely that he filed bogus tax returns and may have skimmed, as David suspected. At the absolute least, he is responsible for wrongfully withholding your money if the LLC ever issued a cash payout. If there are large cash in corporate accounts, some of them are yours, and you can request a distribution if business operations are not disrupted. It was the middle of the week, about 3 weeks after their meeting, when Steve returned to the three. He said that Richmond never sent him the business documentation and that many attempts to contact him had gone unanswered. He wanted to know what they expected him to do. During the conference call, the three buddies exchanged their ideas. Then David added, "I believe we should obtain court orders and freeze bank and investment accounts if it is not too late. I'm scared they'll try to flee. I also believe we should call the IRS and seek a court order regarding the materials." Steve stated he'd get on it the following week. The Springville newspaper published an item regarding an IRS inquiry into a local business and companies doing business as the Starlight Lounge. Steve called the next day after the three had spoken. He stated that Richmond, his son Jared, and his wife were arrested last night. They were arraigned this morning on multiple offenses. Tax fraud and attempting to leave to avoid prosecution are two topics that may be of interest to you. Both guys were additionally charged with resisting arrest, drug selling, pandering, and assault and violence. Apparently, the investigators discovered some other girls on their dates who had been abused in the club. I've filed another lawsuit on your behalf, requesting access to corporate records and a fair portion of the company's revenues. I was able to view some of the LLC tax returns at his accountant's office, but not all of them. The ones I viewed did not indicate your ownership interest in them. You had been completely excluded. No one had prepared anything. I believe you will be fine with the IRS, but I am unsure whether we will ever retrieve any of the cash owing to you. If he hadn't opened his lips at your house the other day, he could have gotten away with it. Also, none of his formal records reflected your ownership. It's wonderful that you retained the documents. The summer was coming to an end, and one of the most important weekends of the year was upon the three friends, Labor Day. They swiftly pushed thoughts of the case and potential monetary bonanza to the back of their minds, as work took priority. They had hired out all of their boats and camping spaces for the full weekend. They even had some people renting camping spots in an unimproved area by the river. The store was busy, as was the small snack bar. Late-season vegetables were selling like hotcakes. The three were never happier. The nights were now cool enough that they could sleep with the windows open once more, and David and John were considering returning to the woods to harvest firewood for the following season. They had to cut additional wood since they were selling some to campers who wanted to have a campfire. All three were earning a fine living now. Patricia's share came to around $5,000 for the summer, and they expected John to get around $1,000. David was expected to receive approximately $12,000. Patricia and John were disappointed that David was not earning a bigger portion of the income from the usage of the land, but he was insistent that he would not accept any more than he was receiving. Their clientele dwindled over time, and by the end of the month, they had closed the canoe rental business. They still hired out fishing boats and camping places, but the work was light. The three of them could handle it on their own. They had discussed closing the small store and snack bar, but on the day they did so, several residents stopped by and expressed their disappointment. Some of the campers also wanted in, so they decided to keep it open and see if they could sell enough to make it profitable. Over the next 2 weeks, they made an average of $50 per day, so they kept it open. As the colder weather arrived, they remained hard preparing the crops for winter and chopping firewood for the following season. Patricia turned to David one evening after supper as they sat on the porch, watching the darkness fall. She responded, "David, I am tired of sleeping alone. I want to move into your bedroom and get married. Can we marry next week?" "Sure, honey. We can get married at any time, and you are welcome to move into my room." Anytime. I was hoping you would move downstairs, but I chose not to say anything. I assumed you'd relocate when you were ready. You also need to determine where you wish to go on honeymoon. That is, if John will keep an eye on the place so we may leave, he explained. Yeah, things have slowed down somewhat. I can now take care of everything. The wedding was tiny and basic. There were no family members on either side, so they asked the local minister to marry them at his church 2 weeks later. All of the employees and their families, as well as their few local acquaintances, were invited. John had planned a little reception at their campground shortly after their first night of marriage, which they spent in David's, now their bed. They left for their honeymoon the next morning after waking up. David and Patricia spent an amazing week on Florida's Gulf Coast at Bradenton Beach. They slept late, ate a lot, and overindulged in the delicious seafood. When they weren't in bed eating, they spent their time lounging around the pool or on the beach, soaking in the sun. When they grew too hot, they would jump into the ocean for a refreshing swim. They had the opportunity to play with a manatee twice while swimming. They both enjoyed Florida, but it was not home by the end of the week. They were both relieved to be returning to the hills and streams of their hometown. The three sat by the river the day after they returned home, watching it run peacefully past. Patricia was seated on David's lap, snuggling. She would occasionally bend in and kiss him gently. His hands occasionally caressed her private places. John grinned as he glanced at the couple. He responded, "Get a room, you two. Sometimes you make me jealous. Yet I am delighted for you." John took a minute to stare out over the river before returning his gaze to Patricia and David, who were blushing. He asked if you had given any thought to putting up some cottages or closed camp shelters. "I believe we have enough wood cut for the upcoming season, and there is still enough nice weather to build at least one this fall, if we get started." David reclined back in his chair, pulling Patricia with him. He, too, glanced out across the river, thinking of the cabins again. He knew the three of them could complete the structure, but did he truly want to take that route? He looked down when he felt Patricia move. She drew back a little, watching his expression. She had a look of expectation, even eagerness on her face. He gave her another gentle kiss and said, "Do you want to do this, honey?" "Yes, I actually do. But if you don't, I can live with it. I just think we could make big money with the cabins. Well, I know it would require more labor, but not much. We might have one of the girls work as a maid or hire one, and I'm excited about the possibilities." David let out another sigh and looked across at John. He remarked, "I really don't want to go that route too badly. But I'll tell you what, John. You take the cottages on as a project. In fact, I think we should discuss the obligations at some point. I recommended sharing responsibility for work and employee supervision in the same way we do now, but formalizing it to 2 people right now, whichever one is available. If a question arises, one of the girls asks, I believe I would prefer a more structured operation than we currently have. I may appear harsh about some of this, but what I want to see is that it is my land and investment. So now it's Patricia's and mine. However, if there is a disagreement or a huge spending of dollars, I would like to have overall control. Otherwise, I believe John should be the foreman for the campsites, as well as any cottages or camping shelters we build. Patricia should be in charge of the marina store and snack bar. I will be largely responsible for the farming operation and administrative duties. Of course, we would always aid each other, just as we do now. For example, I'll need help planting the crops and, to some extent, harvesting them. Patricia will undoubtedly require assistance with sales on busy days, as will you with cleanup. Opening and shutting campgrounds. John, I believe that until it is a significant choice or a large assignment, we should supervise and be accountable for the people working in those areas. As I've laid out. Comments. Patricia and John sat for a moment. They looked at one another, then at David, and nearly simultaneously said, "Sounds good. Let's do it." Okay, gentlemen, I'll spring for 2 tiny cabins right now. If you were correct and they rent well, I will either build more or we can add a few more duplexes. When the weather became too cold to work outside comfortably, they enclosed the huts so they could be heated. That allowed the 3 to complete them during the winter. They were small but luxurious once completed. Both cabins were approximately 500 FT2 and featured a tiny bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, eating area, and living room with a sleeping sofa. They had a wraparound porch with nice chairs. Just before the next season began, they began advertising the cabin's increased facilities, availability. To their amazement, clients began attempting to hire the cabins before the canoeing and swimming season began. Many folks would book cabins in March simply to picnic and enjoy the outdoors. They began to accept reservations for later in the season. They even began accepting bookings and deposits for the limited shelters and open campsites, particularly during holidays and popular weekends. Patricia's eyes shone as she informed her brother and David that all of the better sites, shelters, and cabins were fully booked for Memorial Week and the weekend of July 4th, as well as the 2 weeks surrounding Labor Day. She also informed them that a substantial majority of the slots were reserved for the remainder of the summer. I've even formed a waiting list for upgraded campsites, shelters, and cottages in case one becomes available again. I've even received some requests for boat moorings. Some folks are intending to use their boats to come up from the lake and stay with us, David stated in surprise. I can't believe how fantastic it is. He gazed across their small resort and proceeded. I know the Feelings Resort is typically busy during the hot season, but I never imagined we'd receive so much business here. We're almost a mile upstream from them and the water's not as deep. Jim and the boys said we could fill more cabins, but I didn't believe them. David looked across at John and asked, "Do you want to take on more work? We can construct 3 or 4 extra cabins if you want to increase your management load." The 3 chatted for a while before deciding to start building on 3 more cabins. They hoped to finish 1 or 2 in time to rent them out before the season ended. By July 4th, they had finished 2 more cabins. They had virtually all of the remainder of the summer scheduled for them as well. They completed the final cabin in time for Labor Day. Patricia became unwell when they were building the first cabin, so it took longer to create the second and third ones. She experienced stomach problems and vomited profusely. Finally, David compelled her to visit the doctor. She came back late in the day and approached him. She pressed herself against his frame, threw her arms around his neck, and gave him a deep, soul-searing kiss. The kiss intensified as it went on. Finally, the 2 lovers separated from one another. Patricia was heated and panting. David's jeans were colored, and he was almost pawing at the floor. Patricia looked at him and replied, "The doctor says I am fine, honey," he remarked. "My upset stomach will go away in the next few weeks, but I won't be able to help you much later this summer and fall," she continued, her expression filled with excitement and fear. "Oh, David, I am pregnant. You aren't furious with me, right?" David stood in disbelief. He approached a chair and sat down. Then he simply stared at Patricia. "You're fine, but you're pregnant." Patricia simply nodded her head yes and watched David. Her stomach fluttered with fear. She started thinking, what if he doesn't want a baby? What shall I do? How could I do this to him? I can't kill my baby for David. David began to smile and extended his arms toward Patricia. She started to smile. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she leaped into his arms. John went onto the porch as they were hugging and kissing. When John glanced at the two, he felt terrified. He knew Patricia had gone to the doctor that morning. He asked Patricia, "David, is everything fine? There's nothing wrong, right? Patricia, why are you crying?" David grinned up at John. "No, there's nothing wrong. In fact, that is entirely correct. We are going to have a baby." Over time, both the family and the business expanded. David added a downstairs 2-room nursery. Over time, he and Patricia had 3 children. They were more involved in the business as they grew older. Vegetable sales increased until they started selling produce commercially to a local grocery chain. The resort and food service business expanded until they could keep it open all year. John eventually met and married a young widow. They erected a tiny house on some land they had bought along the river that bordered David and Patricia's farm. John continued to oversee the lodging side of the business, while Patricia and he ran the lodging and recreation side with hired support. Over time, the children of both spouses began to help the elders in areas where they were interested. As the children took on more responsibilities, their parents became less involved. Of course, all of the children attended college and took courses related to their jobs at the resort. David and Patricia were sitting by the river one evening when the 15 and 50 years old. In the distance, they could hear cheerful yells from people having fun at their resort. They watched their children and staff finish yet another day's work. They, along with John and his wife, now only work when there is a specific demand for their services. When the youngsters needed guidance or assistance with a really difficult situation, they spent the remainder of their time in semi-retirement. They traveled on occasion, but usually they relaxed at their resort and enjoyed life. David turned to face Patricia. He reached for her hand and held it while he looked into her eyes again. He said, "Honey, even after all these years, I can't believe how fortunate I am to have discovered you. I'm still grateful you came to me that day on the river. I realized I'd made a mistake when I got my MBA and went to work on Wall Street. Sometimes I think I should go find up the asshole who broke up my engagement to Kathy and thank them both. If they hadn't dumped on me, I would never have been as content as I have been in the past 30 years. I adore you more and more as the years pass. I despise it when we're separated, even for a few hours, and one of us goes to town without the other. I'd heard for years about finding your soulmate, but I believe I fell in love with you before you moved out here, but was too hurt by those 300 hours in New York to recognize it. We hadn't even married yet when I realized we were true soulmates. When we're together, I feel so complete, but also so empty. When we are away, I feel as if a piece of myself is missing. Every day, I adore you more." Patricia grinned at her man. She said, "I know I've told you this before, but you know I was in love when I met you. I just didn't realize how much I loved you. I nearly gave up before you were healed enough to love me back. It's all been worthwhile, though. We have a great home and family. Finally, and most importantly, we have one another. I have never and will never. I'll never love another man like I love you. Many of the men who have come here over the years have attempted to chat me up, and all I felt was coldness. I could never view them as anything other than a customer, no matter how attractive some of them were to other women. They grinned at one other and stretched out to clasp hands. As they gazed into each other's eyes, they heard pounding footsteps and a little shrill voice yelling, "Grandma! Grandpa! Mommy said I may come down to the water to be with you. We arrived early, and I can stay here all day. Can we go swimming, please?" The little blonde-haired munchkin slid onto Patricia's lap and hugged her tightly. David noticed her giving Patricia a sloppy kiss and thought she looked so much like her mother when she was a baby. If I didn't know better, I'd assume that was Jessica and Patricia's laps. She is also very loving to her brother and cousins, much like Jessica was. David reclined back in his chair for one more thought before departing in search of his sons and grandchildren. He knew it was almost time for their weekly family supper, which was held every Sunday afternoon. Many times, not everyone was present, but there was usually a huge turnout. He strolled with a smile, thinking that the old adage is true: when life tosses you lemons, crush them to make lemonade. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened.